They found her beneath the soil of Sovell Woods, just beyond the hedgerows where the village lanes ended. A black straw hat, a broken jaw, and a silence so deep it seemed to absorb the wind. In the spring of 1913, in the hamlet of Goosage St. Michael, Dorset, a life disappeared and an illusion collapsed. Tonight we return to that silence, to understand not just what happened, but why human frailty takes such quiet forms. The year before the Great War, England was still a country of contrasts. Industrial cities belched smoke into the northern sky, but places like Goosage St. Michael moved at the rhythm of the seasons. There were no motor cars, few newspapers, and no railway nearby. The nearest station lay 10 miles distant in Wimborne, its timetables as irrelevant to the villagers as the politics printed beside them. The people of Goosage St. Michael knew the boundaries of their world. Church on Sunday, work on Monday, sleep when the day allowed. This stillness was not peace, it was resignation. The villagers had inherited their roles like family heirlooms. The farmer's son became a farmer. The servant girl became a servant. The rector's children drifted into clerical or teaching posts. Ambition was a word that belonged to towns, not here. The people of Goosage St. Michael accepted the modest architecture of their days, each one building upon the last until death called their names from the pulpit. The post office, set just beside the main lane, was a small room attached to a cottage. Behind its narrow counter, William Walter Burton served letters, parcels, and the occasional coin remittance from sons working in the Navy or in the northern mills. The villagers called him Bill. To them, he was a symbol of reliability, young but steady, punctual in his duties, polite in speech. His position carried quiet respect, for in a world that moved by word of mouth, the man who handled letters held the thread that connected the village to the rest of England. Burton was 29 that spring, tall, lean, with dark hair and the heavy hands of a man accustomed to physical labor. He had been born in the region, one of several children, and had risen slightly above his birth by means of diligence rather than inheritance. His wife, Lillian Dover, was 12 years older, the daughter of a local carpenter. Together they kept the post office running while raising their young son, Cyril. The house smelled of ink, tobacco, and boiled cabbage, the ordinary scent of rural life. To his neighbors, Bill Burton embodied the virtues they admired: industriousness, sobriety, and godliness. He attended church every Sunday, sang in the choir, and exchanged polite greetings with the rector after service. He also served as a part-time gamekeeper at nearby Manor Farm, setting snares for rabbits and maintaining the woodlands. It was an arrangement common in small communities, one man holding multiple roles to supplement a modest wage. Yet this industrious respectability came with another trait: an unspoken pride in being the village's dependable man. In the hierarchy of rural England, even minor responsibility carried weight. The postmaster was not a landowner, but he held keys, handled stamps and coins, and saw letters that others did not. That subtle power, so small as to be invisible, nourished something in Burton. Beneath his calm exterior lay a hunger for recognition, the kind that quiet men often mistake for love. The villagers trusted him completely. They believed in his decency because they needed to believe that their world still functioned upon moral order. But order can be a fragile construction, built not from truth, but from routine. In a place where everyone's life was visible from the lane, secrecy became the rarest currency of all. Goosage St. Michael existed in a state of collective blindness, a kind of moral sleep. The people knew hardship but avoided scandal. Poverty could be tolerated. Sin, however, had to be hidden. The church reinforced this unwritten rule. Beneath its sermons on forgiveness lay a quieter doctrine of appearance. To be respectable was to be good. Men drank discreetly, women whispered privately, and the village moved forward as though no one ever strayed from their path. It was within this atmosphere of stillness and suppression that the seeds of tragedy began to grow. For in 1913, secrecy was both protection and poison. A rumor could travel faster than a train, but silence could last a lifetime. In the evenings, when the post office closed, Burton would sometimes step outside to smoke his pipe. The sound of the bellows from the blacksmith's shop echoed faintly across the lane, and smoke curled against the dusk. He was known to play his melodeon then, a small accordion whose thin, reedy notes drifted through the hedgerows like the last breath of daylight. It was music of habit, not joy. Lillian sat by the fire, mending clothes or writing her weekly letter to her sister in Somerset. The neighbors would later remember those nights as peaceful, even idyllic. They would recall the sound of Burton's playing as a comfort, something steady in the turning of the seasons. None of them imagined that beneath that calm exterior he had begun to lead another life. The turning point did not arrive suddenly. It began, as such things do, with curiosity, the glance of a stranger, the brief crossing of paths. The new cook at Manor Farm had arrived early that spring. Her name was Winifred Mary Mitchell, though most called her Winnie. She was 23, with dark hair pinned tightly beneath her cap and a manner both shy and direct. She came from modest stock, one of several children raised in nearby villages, her family eking out a living through domestic service and seasonal labor. In the rigid social order of rural England, a servant girl like Winnie occupied an invisible tier, seen, spoken to, but rarely regarded. Yet to Burton her presence would prove more powerful than he could have anticipated, for in a place that had known only routine, she represented the unknown, an idea of youth and vitality that stirred the quiet resentments he had buried beneath duty and prayer. At the time, no one noticed their early conversations in the yard or the way his errands to the farm became more frequent. Gossip in such villages was a form of ventilation, a way to release the pressure of confinement. But this liaison escaped even gossip's reach, hidden beneath the shared assumption that nothing of significance could ever happen in Gossage St. Michael. There is a peculiar stillness in places, untouched by modernity, a silence that magnifies the smallest deviation from order. It was this stillness that would soon shatter, though not with noise, but with the slow unfolding of consequence. For now, the postmaster's lamp still burned late into the night, a small pool of light behind drawn curtains. Within that quiet room, letters waited to be sent, receipts lay neatly folded, and a man's double life had only just begun. By the spring of 1913, William Burton had become part of the landscape of Gossage St. Michael, solid, predictable, and unremarkable. He was the kind of man people described as steady, which in rural Dorset was one of the highest compliments a person could earn. He rose at 6 each morning, tended the small garden behind the post office, and opened his counter by 8. His handwriting was neat, his arithmetic precise. To those who passed through his door for stamps or telegrams, he was courteous but never warm, a man shaped by the expectation that dignity was measured in silence. His wife, Lillian, was a woman of plain appearance but careful manners. She had been a governess before their marriage, and though she was older, she carried herself with a quiet authority. The villagers respected her. She was steady too, and that steadiness had become the rhythm of their household. In photographs from that time, she looked serious, her hair pinned tightly, her clothes sensible and dark. There was no hint that her husband's loyalties were shifting beneath the surface. From the outside, their life appeared enviable by local standards. They owned a piano, kept a small flock of hens, and could afford candles for every room. Yet for Burton, domestic life had begun to feel like confinement, a ritual of meals, letters, and polite conversation. It was not misery that stirred his restlessness, but something subtler, the quiet erosion of significance. He was known, yes, but not needed in any way that mattered to him. Respectability, for all its comfort, offered no passion, no renewal. When he played his melodeon in the evenings, it was partly to fill that emptiness. The music drifted through the narrow lanes, settling over the cottages like smoke, and though it soothed his neighbors, it did nothing to soothe him. Each note reminded him that life was passing, measured not in adventure, but in repetition. Beneath the church hymns and family routines, another self had begun to form, one that would eventually break through the shell of the dutiful postmaster. That other self emerged first in glances. Burton noticed the new cook at Manor Farm while delivering a parcel of tobacco to the bailiff. Winifred Mitchell was different from the women he knew, younger, curious, and possessed of a liveliness that did not yet recognize its own limits. He began to linger during his visits, asking about the day's weather, the rabbits in the traps, the quality of the bread. At first his attention seemed harmless, neighborly interest in a fellow worker. But for a man accustomed to control, fascination was the beginning of undoing. To understand what followed, one must understand the world they inhabited. In Edwardian England, class boundaries were unspoken but absolute. A man of Burton's position, neither poor nor privileged, occupied a narrow corridor between servitude and aspiration. His respectability depended on how convincingly he imitated the manners of those above him, and how firmly he kept distance from those below. Winifred, a servant girl earning a few shillings a week, belonged to that lower tier. Any intimacy between them was therefore not just forbidden, it was absurd. Yet it was precisely that impossibility that gave their meetings their power. What began as casual kindness became something charged. He found excuses to visit the farm more often, bringing letters, tools, or small parcels that could easily have waited. She was flattered by his attention, as many women in service were when a man of slightly higher standing noticed them. Their conversations were brief, their gestures cautious, but in a village where even a glance could carry meaning, each encounter added weight to the secret they were building. Burton's letters to her, written on the same paper he used for official correspondence, were careful and restrained. They contained no declarations of love, only small assurances of affection and concern. Yet in those pages his handwriting softened. The man who had spent years observing rules found himself writing between them, filling the margins with fragments of longing that could not have been spoken aloud. In the post office ledger, every transaction was recorded in black ink, dates, names, amounts, all preserved with mechanical precision. In his letters to Winnie, the ink flowed more freely, as though the same pen had learned a new language. It was not passion he expressed, but release, the dangerous relief of being seen. For Winnie, the attention carried another meaning. She was 23, of limited education, and bound by the knowledge that her future would mirror her mother's. Service, marriage if she was lucky, poverty if she was not. In Burton's company, she sensed the possibility of something different, affection that lifted her, even briefly, above her station. When he gave her the gold bracelet, she took it as a sign. For him, it was only a token, a gesture made to maintain the illusion of care. In the evenings, he continued to play his melodeon, and Lillian continued to listen, unaware that the music had changed. The man she saw was the same one she had married, tidy, soft-spoken, punctual, but something had shifted in his gaze, a restlessness that even she, in her quiet devotion, could not ignore. She might have spoken of it, but in those years a wife's silence was considered a virtue. She carried her doubts alone, as most women did, transforming uncertainty into habit. Burton's dual existence deepened through repetition. By day, he was the postmaster, the gamekeeper, the husband. By evening, in the woods or along the farm path, he was the man she called Bill. The two selves did not collide. They coexisted, each one feeding the other. Respectability gave him cover. Secrecy gave him purpose. And all the while, the boundaries of his conscience eroded so gradually that he scarcely noticed. The affair remained hidden through the winter, concealed beneath the same routine that had defined his life. But with spring came exposure, not in rumor, but in consequence. Winnie's letters grew urgent. She wrote of her dreams to leave Dorset, to start anew in Canada, where her brother had settled. She believed Burton might follow her there. To her, this was hope. To him, it was threat. By then, his letters had grown shorter, his visits less frequent. He had begun to understand the trap he had built for himself. The affair, once a secret pleasure, now threatened the very respectability that had given him his standing. In a world where reputation was survival, scandal was a form of death. And so he withdrew, clinging to the illusion that retreat could erase what had already been set in motion. That spring, the fields around Gussage St. Michael were bright with new growth, the hedges alive with birdsong. The village moved toward Easter with its usual rhythm, church cleaning, markets, the first lambing. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But within the postmaster's mind, the stillness had begun to fracture. The second life he had nurtured now stood between him and everything he claimed to value. Each evening, the lamp in the post office window burned later, and the music of the melodeon grew softer, slower, as though the air itself were thickening. Respectability had turned into confinement, and secrecy into fear. The village still trusted him. They would continue to trust him until the day they found the grave beneath the trees. For now, the night deepened over the fields, and the man everyone called Bill sat alone at his table, the ink on his fingers dark as blood. The spring of 1913 brought with it a brief brightness over Dorset, a season that seemed to linger on the edge of memory even before it had passed. Fields that had lain dull and brown through winter began to flush with green again, and the air carried the scent of turned soil and wood smoke. To the villagers of Gussage St. Michael, this change was both ordinary and sacred, a sign that life, though repetitive, continued to renew itself. Yet that same renewal also carried new arrivals, a few laborers, a dairymaid, and, at Manor Farm, a young cook whose presence would stir something that had long been dormant in the heart of the postmaster. Her name was Winifred Mary Mitchell. She was 23, born in nearby Cranbourne, one of several children of Rose and Charles Mitchell, both of whom had worked in domestic service before settling into a life of quiet hardship. Winnie, as her friends called her, had grown up in small rented cottages, moving from one position to another as employers changed or dismissed their staff. Life as a servant was unstable by design. Wages were low, and employment came with rules that blurred the line between labor and obedience. Every word, every gesture was subject to judgment. Winnie was accustomed to such restraint. She had learned early how to make herself useful, how to read the moods of others, how to smile when spoken to, but never too much. Yet beneath her composure lay a quiet yearning, a belief that life could offer something beyond servitude if she could only find the right person, the right chance. When she took the position at Manor Farm in February, she saw it as another step on a familiar path, not realizing it would lead to her final one. She shared a small attic room with May Bailey, another servant close to her age. The room was cold, its single window overlooking the orchard behind the farmhouse. Their days began before dawn, lighting the kitchen fire, fetching water, scrubbing, baking, and serving meals. The routine was endless but predictable, the kind of life that dulled time into manageable fragments. Yet Winnie approached it with the energy of someone who had not yet given up on the idea that something better might exist beyond the hedgerows. It was during one of Burton's visits to Manor Farm that she first met him. He had come to deliver a parcel to the bailiff and paused in the yard when he saw her at the pump. The meeting was brief, polite, unremarkable. But in a place where strangers were few, even a simple exchange could take root in the imagination. Burton, in his pressed coat and careful posture, represented a different world, one that seemed respectable and self-assured. For Winnie, who had spent her life serving others, his attention carried an unfamiliar warmth. At first, their interactions were small interruptions in the monotony of rural life. A nod across the yard, a brief conversation at the gate, a shared remark about the weather. He was courteous, even cautious. But there was something in the way he lingered after speaking, as though waiting for permission to stay longer. To the outside observer, nothing about their acquaintance would have seemed improper. In a village so small, everyone knew everyone, and familiarity was inevitable. Yet secrecy often begins under the guise of familiarity. Burton's visits became more frequent. Sometimes he brought small parcels to the farmhouse that required no delivery. Other times he came under the pretense of checking game traps near the woods. He spoke in a measured way, as he always did, but his tone with her carried a softness he reserved for no one else. He began to leave small notes, folded and discreet, tucked into the handle of her broom or slipped into her apron pocket. She answered in kind, her handwriting neat but hesitant. In those letters, affection grew quickly, almost automatically. It was the kind of affection born not from passion, but from the recognition of loneliness in another person. Both were trapped, she by class and gender, he by respectability and fear of stagnation. To each, the other seemed like a doorway. For Winnie, it was the promise of escape. For Burton, it was the illusion of renewal. Neither saw the danger in mistaking longing for salvation. By March, their meetings had taken on a pattern. In the late afternoons, after her work was done and the other servants were occupied, she would walk towards Sovell Plantation, the small patch of woodland that bordered the farm. There, between the trees, they could speak without fear of being seen. These meetings were brief, cautious, and filled with the kind of tension that makes silence feel heavier than words. He would ask about her family, her plans, her brother in Canada. She would listen as he spoke of his work and his tiredness, of how life in a small place could feel smaller each year. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a brooch, a comb, a bracelet of cheap gold that looked expensive enough to be cherished. To her, each object felt like proof that she mattered. To him, they were tokens meant to pacify a feeling he did not yet understand. For the first time in years, Burton felt alive. Not in the moral sense, but in the physical one. The risk, the secrecy, the recognition. It was intoxicating. The world of church pews and postal ledgers seemed distant when he was with her, but secrecy has its own momentum. Each hidden meeting required another lie, each gift another justification. The postmaster of Gossage St. Michael, the man trusted by all, was slowly building a second life in the shadows of the plantation. The irony was cruel. The same precision that made him diligent in his work now served to conceal his transgressions. He arranged his schedule so carefully that no one suspected. He even spoke kindly of Winnie in passing, the way one might mention a neighbor's daughter. Yet the village was a living organism. It sensed change even before it was named. A few of the older women began to notice Burton's longer absences, the way he sometimes returned from the farm with dust on his boots and a distracted expression. Lillian, his wife, said nothing, but silence is not the same as ignorance. She began to watch him with the quiet apprehension of someone who has recognized an echo in her own home, a sound that does not belong there. For Winnie, the secret gave her a sense of purpose. She had no illusions about her place in society, but she believed in emotion as a kind of equalizer. Love, she thought, was not bound by rank. When she wrote to her brother in Canada that spring, she hinted at a possible change of plans and spoke of dreams she could not yet name. In her mind, the man who met her in the woods was not the postmaster of Gossage St. Michael. He was simply Bill, the man who had promised her something beyond servitude. The bracelet he had given her glimmered faintly in the light when she worked, and more than once, May Bailey remarked that it seemed too fine for a servant girl. Winnie smiled and said nothing. Some secrets, she believed, were best kept quiet until the world was ready to understand them. But the world of Gossage St. Michael did not change. It only waited. The fields ripened, the hedgerows thickened, and the woods darkened in the longer days of April. The sound of the melodeon still drifted from the post office each evening, soft and steady, carrying across the lanes like a hymn to routine. In that same twilight at the edge of Sovell Plantation, a young woman paused beneath the trees, her hand resting on the bracelet that bound her to a man who could not afford to be caught. The breeze stirred through the leaves, and the music from the village faded into silence. By the time April unfolded across Dorset, the affair between William Burton and Winifred Mitchell had taken on the quiet, rhythmic certainty of habit. It was not a story of grand passion or reckless abandon, but of two people quietly rewriting the boundaries of their lives. Their meetings in Sovell Plantation no longer felt illicit. They felt inevitable, part of a private calendar that only the two of them obeyed. The woods themselves seemed to conspire with their secrecy. Sovell Plantation was a patch of mixed trees on the edge of farmland, neither wild nor cultivated, a forgotten corner where the sounds of the village could not reach. The air there was heavy with moss and the sweetness of young leaves. When Burton and Winnie met among the trees, the world contracted to the sound of their breathing and the rustle of birds overhead. He brought her small things: an apple, a ribbon, a scrap of paper with a poem copied in his careful handwriting. She brought him silence and attention, which to a man like Burton were gifts of immeasurable worth. There was no open talk of love between them. That would have required honesty, and honesty would have broken the spell. Instead, their connection thrived on ambiguity, on the delicate balance between what was said and what was only implied. For Burton, she became the mirror in which he saw a version of himself untouched by disappointment. For Winnie, he was a path out of obscurity, a man who seemed to belong to a world she had only glimpsed from a distance. In small communities, relationships such as theirs depended not only on secrecy, but on control. Burton's caution was absolute. He insisted on choosing their meeting places and times. He warned her to speak to no one about him. Each instruction was framed as concern for her safety, but beneath it lay the fear that his carefully built reputation might crumble. He had lived his entire life within the narrow margins of acceptability. To lose that would be to lose everything. The paradox was that his desire for control, the same trait that had made him successful in his work, was the very thing that would eventually destroy him. Winnie, for her part, mistook that control for devotion. In a world that rarely allowed women the luxury of being noticed, a man's possessiveness could feel like importance. Her letters to him, few though they were, carried an almost childlike faith. She wrote of her longing for change, of her wish to travel, of her certainty that he, too, must feel trapped in the village. Her words were hopeful, but unguarded. She imagined a life beyond Dorset, a small house in Canada, perhaps, where no one knew their past. It was a fantasy that gave meaning to her long days of labor and her longer nights of waiting. Burton read those letters with a tightening in his chest that was not quite affection and not yet fear. He knew what she dreamed of. He knew, too, that he could never give it to her. The cost of her belief was rising with each day that passed. He began to avoid her for longer stretches of time, inventing errands or staying home under the pretext of illness. Yet the pull of her expectation was relentless. Each letter demanded an answer, each silence a justification. He could no longer see a way to retreat without tearing apart the careful image he had crafted. Outside their secret world, the village moved on, blind to the storm forming in its midst. The rector prepared sermons about charity and restraint. The farmers worried about the price of grain. Lillian Burton attended to her household as she always had. The rhythms of rural life, unchanged for generations, gave the illusion that nothing terrible could ever happen there. The people of Goussaige St. Michael believed themselves protected by their obscurity. In truth, it was their isolation that made tragedy possible. When Burton and Winnie met now, there was an unease beneath the surface of their meetings. She began to ask questions. When would they go? How would they afford the passage? What would they tell others? Her words pressed against the limits of the fiction he had built. Each question was a reminder that her dream required action, and action meant exposure. He would answer vaguely, promising to see what could be done, or claiming that he was waiting for the right moment. The evasions only deepened her conviction that he was planning something significant. Their encounters in the woods became quieter, almost strained. He still brought her small tokens, a hairpin, a scarf, but there was a distance in his manner. She mistook it for worry, unaware that it was dread. He'd begun to imagine the consequences of discovery, the public humiliation, the trial, the certainty of ruin. Every letter she wrote became a threat he could not acknowledge, every affectionate gesture a weight he could not bear. There is a strange duality in the psychology of deceit. Those who lie for long enough begin to divide themselves in two, the self that commits the act and the self that observes it, each convinced of its own necessity. Burton lived in that division. In the post office, he was the trusted official, handling the correspondence of others with meticulous care. In Sovell Plantation, he was a man stripped of pretense, bound to a promise he had never meant to keep. Each day widened the distance between these selves until he no longer recognized where one ended and the other began. For Winnie, the world was narrowing. Her letters home grew shorter, her conversations with May Bailey less open. She spoke sometimes of the future, of leaving Dorset altogether, but her tone carried the fragile brightness of someone clinging to a single idea. Her mother, Rose, assumed she was simply restless. Servant girls often changed positions without notice. It was part of the trade. Yet there was something in her daughter's eyes that unsettled her, a mix of fear and anticipation that did not belong to a person at peace. One evening, Winnie confided to May that she believed she was with child. She said it softly, as though the words themselves might shatter something fragile. Whether she truly believed it or only hoped to bind Burton closer to her, no one would ever know. What is certain is that from that moment, her sense of time changed. She began to speak of leaving not in abstract terms, but as an immediate necessity. She wanted to go to London and from there to Canada. She said that Bill would go with her. In her mind, the plan was already in motion. In his, it was unthinkable. He could not follow her without destroying his life, yet he could not abandon her without risking exposure. Between those two impossibilities, something dark began to take shape. A thought so quiet he could almost mistake it for fear. When the last week of March arrived, the air grew heavy with the scent of rain. The woods were soft underfoot, the fields pale with early growth. On Sunday evening, Burton walked alone through Sovell Plantation, his pipe unlit in his hand. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the bells from the church ringing for evensong. Beneath the sound, the silence of the trees seemed to press in around him. He stood for a long time beside a patch of freshly turned earth, watching the ground as though it might speak. Then he knelt and began to dig. By the final days of March, the restlessness that had settled over Winifred Mitchell had grown into a quiet resolve. To those around her, she seemed distracted but content, humming under her breath as she worked, pausing now and then to look out through the window toward the line of trees at the far end of the fields. She had begun to believe, with a conviction that felt almost sacred, that she and Bill Burton would soon leave Gussage St. Michael behind. The letters they had exchanged, carefully folded and kept beneath her clothing, had become her map to a new life. She'd spoken often of Canada, of her brother who lived there and the stories he sent home about open land and opportunity. In her imagination, it was a place untouched by the rules that confined her in Dorset. She pictured herself there as though stepping into another version of her life, one free of service, secrecy, and shame, and she believed that Bill would come with her. In her mind, he was not the cautious man who guarded his reputation in the village. He was the man who spoke softly in the woods, who told her that he, too, longed to escape. Burton had fed that belief, not out of hope, but out of fear. In each letter he sent, he offered vague promises couched in words of tenderness. He told her to wait, to trust him, to say nothing to anyone. He wrote that he was arranging things, that he needed time. What he needed, though, was distance. Distance from the problem he had created and the woman who now embodied it. For in Burton's world, the walls of respectability were closing in. The small village that had once felt like the measure of safety now felt like a trap. every glance from a neighbor, every casual greeting at the church door seemed charged with suspicion, though no one yet suspected anything. He felt it nonetheless, the oppressive awareness that his secret could not remain hidden forever. He had seen what scandal could do to a man in a place like this. Rumors did not die. They hardened into truth. At night, as his wife slept beside him, Burton lay awake listening to the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. He imagined the future as a narrowing corridor with no exit. To confess would mean ruin. To flee would mean exposure. To remain would mean living under the threat of discovery. The letters from Winnie came like echoes of his own dread, each one filled with hope that only deepened his despair. Winnie's conviction grew stronger as his faltered. She began to tell May Bailey small pieces of her plan, speaking in whispers as they lay in their narrow beds. She said that she would soon leave the farm, that Bill had promised to take her first to London and then across the ocean. She asked May not to tell anyone, not even her mother. To May, it sounded like fantasy, the kind of dream servant girls often spoke of but never pursued. Still, she promised to keep the secret. It is difficult now, more than a century later, to grasp the scale of risk that a woman like Winnie faced. In 1913, to be unmarried and pregnant was not merely shameful, it was ruinous. Employment would be lost, housing forfeited, reputation destroyed. The community that once provided belonging would turn instantly to exile. Whether Winnie truly believed herself to be with child or had only said it in desperation, the fear was the same. She had nowhere to turn but to the man who had already begun to withdraw. Burton's fear of exposure transformed into a kind of cold logic. He began to think of his situation as a problem to be solved, not a tragedy unfolding. He convinced himself that if Winnie left quietly, if she simply disappeared, then life could return to its familiar order. But he also knew that she would not leave quietly. She loved him too deeply, trusted him too completely. Her faith in him had become a threat to the life he had built. On Sunday, the 30th of March, the day before she vanished, Burton walked through the woods again. He had brought a spade. The ground was damp, the soil soft with spring rain. He dug for nearly an hour in a small clearing hidden from the path, the sound of his labor swallowed by the rustling of the branches above. When he stopped, a shallow trench stretched before him, a space large enough to contain the thing he dared not name. He filled it loosely with leaves and chalk, then covered the surface with fallen twigs until it looked undisturbed. The next day dawned with the faint scent of rain in the air. Winnie dressed with unusual care, choosing her best clothes, a black skirt, a white blouse, the straw hat trimmed with ostrich feathers that she had saved for special occasions. She even placed her false teeth, polished and gleaming, though they still caused her discomfort. She wanted to look her best for Bill. She believed he would take her away that very afternoon. When May asked where she was going, she smiled and said only that she was meeting someone. She asked her friend not to tell a soul. It was around 3 o'clock when she mounted her bicycle and set off toward the hill. The wheels clicked softly against the gravel, and the breeze lifted the feathers of her hat as she rode. A few villagers saw her pass, but no one thought much of it. Women often cycled to nearby farms for errands or visits. The image they carried with them, a young woman on a bicycle, smiling beneath her hat, would linger for years, long after they learned what became of her. Burton was already waiting in Sovell Plantation. He had brought with him a shotgun borrowed that morning from the undertaker's son. He had claimed he needed it to deal with a troublesome cat that was killing fowl near the farm. It was an easy lie, and the boy thought nothing of it. Burton carried the gun wrapped in sacking, his heart steady, his thoughts strangely clear. Winnie arrived a few minutes later, pushing her bicycle along the narrow path. The meeting was brief, the conversation low. What words passed between them, no one would ever know. Perhaps she spoke again of Canada. Perhaps he told her it was impossible. Perhaps she saw, in that final moment, the truth he had hidden from her. What is known is that 2 gunshots echoed faintly through the trees, sometime between 3 and 4 that afternoon. No one in the village heard them above the wind. By 5 o'clock, Burton had returned the gun, explaining calmly that the matter with the cat had been settled. He washed his hands at the pump behind the post office and joined his wife for supper. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows, he played his melodeon, the same soft tunes he had always played. To anyone passing by, it was a sound of comfort, a symbol of the quiet order of village life. But in the woods beyond, the air was still, the soil freshly turned. For several days, no one asked about Winnie. It was assumed she had gone to London, as she'd often said she would. Her mother expected a letter, but none came. Only when the bicycle was found leaning against an apple tree in Sovell plantation did unease begin to spread. Yet even then, the villagers could not imagine what had truly happened. The illusion of peace held a little longer, stretching thin across the fields as the April rain began to fall. And somewhere beneath that rain, the soil waited to speak. The first days after Winifred Mitchell vanished passed in that strange, weightless quiet that follows an event no one yet understands. On the farm, her absence was noted, but not immediately feared. Servants often left without notice, especially young women with dreams that did not fit within the confines of domestic service. A missed day or two was hardly cause for alarm, yet by the end of that week, unease began to ripple through Manor Farm like the first stirrings of wind before a storm. When May Bailey entered their shared attic room, she found the bed neatly made, the few belongings folded with care. There was no sign of struggle, no hint of haste, just the emptiness of a space quietly abandoned. Winnie's small case of clothes was missing, and on the dresser lay a comb, a brush, and a ribbon she had worn only days before. It was as though she had stepped out expecting to return, but never did. The others assumed she had gone to London. She had spoken of it often enough, and the idea fit neatly into what everyone wished to believe. The cook needed a better position. The young woman wanted to see the city. She had family connections there. These explanations were comforting precisely because they demanded no action. But comfort is rarely truth. In the small house beside the post office, William Burton maintained his routines with almost deliberate precision. He rose early, sorted the morning mail, and greeted customers with the same calm politeness that had long defined him. Those who saw him in those days remarked later that he seemed particularly cheerful, as though freed from some invisible burden. After supper, he played his melodeon while his wife mended clothes by the fire. To the neighbors passing on the lane, the sound of his music was reassurance that all was right in the world. But beneath that surface, the first cracks had already begun to form. Burton could not silence the small, persistent sounds that memory leaves behind. The rustle of fabric, the echo of a voice carried by wind, the dull thud of soil falling where it should not. He had buried her quickly, working by instinct more than plan. The rain that fell that evening had softened the ground, making it easy to dig and easier still to conceal. Yet even as he covered the last trace of her body, he understood that concealment was not the same as erasure. He tried to believe that the matter was finished. He told himself that Winnie had left for London as she had always intended. He rehearsed this version until it began to sound like truth. But guilt, unlike rumor, does not need an audience to thrive. It grows in solitude, feeding on silence. Winnie's mother, Rose Mitchell, waited patiently for the letter that never came. Days turned into weeks. At first, she excused the delay. London was large, she reasoned, and finding work there took time. But by mid-April, her patience gave way to unease. She had heard nothing from her daughter, not even a note to confirm her arrival. When 2 of her younger daughters came home one afternoon saying they had found Winnie's bicycle propped against an apple tree in Sovell plantation, Rose felt a chill that no rational explanation could dispel. She walked to the woods herself, her boots sinking into the soft ground, and there she found the bicycle exactly as described, upright, untouched, as though waiting for its rider to return. She noticed the impression of a man's shoe in the soil nearby, but thought little of it. People often passed that way, and in any case, she could not imagine danger in a place so familiar. She brought the bicycle home, intending to ask around discreetly. That evening, she received a message from the farm. Winnie had not returned to work. The note was polite but perplexed, asking if her daughter had indeed gone to London as planned. Rose replied that she believed she had. It was only later that night, as she looked at the bicycle leaning against her wall, that doubt began to take root. Then, unexpectedly, Bill Burton appeared at her door. He was polite as ever, hat in hand, his tone composed. He asked if she had seen or heard from Winnie. The question seemed genuine, even concerned. Rose admitted that she was growing worried and mentioned her intention to speak to the police. Burton's reply was calm and approving. "That is the best thing you can do," he said. He promised to let her know if he heard anything. It was a performance as precise as any he had ever given. He knew how to sound helpful without seeming intrusive, how to express concern without inviting scrutiny. His control was absolute, at least for the moment. A few days later, Rose did report the disappearance to the police in Wimborne. The officers listened with polite detachment. Missing servants were not unusual. Young women left their posts for all manner of reasons: marriage, pregnancy, disgrace. The constables made a few inquiries but found no trace of her. No train tickets had been purchased under her name, no letters sent to her family. They advised patience. Perhaps, they said, the girl simply needed time. The investigation might have ended there had it not been for small coincidences that refused to stay quiet. Burton, hearing that the authorities were now involved, began to make subtle visits, first to the farm, then to May Bailey, whom he suspected knew more than she had admitted. He told her not to mention his name to anyone, saying only that he did not want gossip to reach his wife. His concern seemed plausible, but to May it carried an undercurrent she could not define. She later described his manner as strained, his eyes tired and strange. Meanwhile, the village began to whisper. They spoke of the missing girl, of her beauty, of her mysterious absence. They speculated about London, about lovers, about shame. Some pitied her. Others condemned her without evidence. In places like Goussages St. Michael, morality was both shield and weapon. To vanish without explanation was to invite judgment, and judgment came easily to those who stayed. Burton listened to these conversations with practiced composure, nodding at the right moments, offering sympathy where it was expected. But inside, he felt the first stirring of panic. The story he had told himself was beginning to unravel. The bicycle, the silence, the police inquiries, all of it formed a pattern that could not be dismissed. He began to return to the woods, walking the paths at dusk as though checking that the earth still held his secret. Once or twice, villagers saw him there, smoking his pipe, standing motionless among the trees. They thought little of it at the time. Later, they would remember. In late April, nearly a month after Winnie's disappearance, the first real sign of her fate emerged. It came not from a constable, but from chance. A local dairyman named George Dillingham and his wife were walking through Sovell Plantation when a sudden shower forced them to take shelter beneath a tree. There, in the wet leaves at their feet, they noticed something pale, 2 small false teeth, clean and intact. They picked them up, puzzled, and later mentioned the discovery to the village rector, Reverend Wright. Troubled by the detail, the rector reported it to the police. At that moment, the ground beneath Sovell Plantation began to give up its silence. Burton, hearing of the renewed search, felt something collapse within him. Not panic exactly, but resignation. The secret he had buried had started to rise. He could not stop it. Only watch as the careful walls of his double life began to crumble like wet soil. Outside his window, the evening rain fell softly, washing the dust from the lane. In the distance, the bell of St. Michael's Church marked the hour, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows, beneath the dripping branches, the earth waited for human hands to disturb it once more. Monday, the 31st of March, 1913, began as an ordinary day. The air carried the faint sharpness of early spring, and the lanes around Gussage St. Michael were still slick from the weekend rain. On the hedgerows, buds trembled with the promise of warmth, but the ground underfoot remained cold, soft, and easily marked. It was the kind of day that villagers would later remember, not for what it was, but for what it became. The day a quiet place was altered forever. At Manor Farm, Winifred Mitchell woke earlier than usual. She dressed with deliberate care, her movements steady and unhurried. The small attic room was dim, lit only by a slice of light seeping through the curtain. She put on her best clothes, a dark skirt, a starched blouse, and a coat she had brushed clean the night before. On her head, she placed the black straw hat adorned with ostrich feathers, an item too fine for a servant, yet one that made her feel almost grand. She even polished her false teeth, though they pinched her gums and made speaking awkward. That small discomfort mattered little. This was a day for appearances. When May Bailey saw her, she was struck by how carefully Winnie had prepared herself. It was not a look of vanity, but of purpose. May asked where she was going, and Winnie smiled, saying only that she had been asked to meet someone. She added that he wanted her to look smart, as if they were going somewhere together. Before leaving, she took her small case, packed with a few items of clothing, enough to suggest travel but not enough for emigration. She told May again not to speak of it. Secrecy had become a habit between them, one born not of conspiracy, but of misplaced trust. The bicycle waited just outside the kitchen door. Its tires were thin and worn, its chain oiled recently. She wheeled it down the path, skirt tucked neatly, and began to pedal toward the lane that led uphill. The wind caught the feathers on her hat, fluttering them like a small flag. She did not look back. Somewhere beyond the fields, among the trees of Sovell Plantation, William Burton was already waiting. He had spent much of the previous evening preparing himself, though not in any visible way. Outwardly, he had behaved as usual, attending to his duties, dining with his wife, playing his melodeon before bed. But inside, a grim resolve had settled. He had borrowed a shotgun that morning from Leonard Mitchell, the undertaker's son, claiming that he needed it to shoot a troublesome cat that had been killing chickens at a nearby farm. It was a lie spoken without hesitation. He returned home with the gun wrapped in a sack, resting it briefly in the post office before setting out toward the plantation. The path through Sovell Plantation was narrow, hemmed in by trees and undergrowth. In early spring, the leaves were not yet thick enough to obscure the sky entirely, and sunlight filtered through in shifting patches. It was a place he knew well. He had walked there countless times in his role as gamekeeper, setting traps, checking snares, carrying his gun in the same familiar manner. But that day, the weight of the weapon in his hands felt different, heavier, deliberate. He reached the small clearing where he had dug the trench the day before. The soil was damp and pale with chalk. He checked that it was still undisturbed, then sat on a fallen branch to wait. Time in the woods moves strangely. Minutes blur into hours. He heard birds, the distant lowing of cattle, and once the faint echo of a church bell. When the sound of the bicycle approached, it came first as a soft metallic hum, then as the irregular crunch of tires over stones. What passed between them in those final moments can only be imagined. There were no witnesses, only fragments pieced together from his later confession and the physical traces left behind. Perhaps she greeted him with relief, perhaps with reproach. Perhaps she spoke of their future, the journey to London, the promise of Canada. Or perhaps she saw in his eyes something she had never seen before, a stillness too complete to be calm. He later told the prison chaplain that she had grown angry, that she had threatened to write to his wife, that she had driven him beyond reason. But those words came long after, shaped by guilt and by the need to make his actions comprehensible. What remains certain is this: 2 gunshots were heard that afternoon, muffled by distance and wind. One struck her in the head, another in the neck. The first likely killed her instantly. The second was either panic or certainty. The rest was method. He dragged her body the few yards to the trench he had prepared, placed her inside still wearing the hat with the ostrich feathers, and covered her with soil. He worked quickly, his movements mechanical. When the hole was filled, he scattered leaves and branches across the surface until the ground looked undisturbed. There was no ritual, no prayer, only silence. Afterward, he wiped his hands on the grass, collected her small case, and returned toward the village. Somewhere along the path, he paused to light his pipe. Smoke drifted upward through the trees, the same gray spirals that would later be seen by a passing shepherd who remembered only a man standing alone, calm and unhurried. By 5 o'clock, Burton was back at the post office. He returned the shotgun to Leonard Mitchum, saying with casual finality that the cat was dead and asking that the matter remain private. The boy agreed easily enough. Burton then washed his hands at the pump, changed his boots, and joined his wife for tea. The evening unfolded like any other. A meal of bread and cold meat, a few words about the day's errands, the soft music of the melodeon drifting out into the dusk. To Lillian, nothing seemed amiss. She noticed only that her husband appeared unusually relaxed, even cheerful. Later, when the house had quieted, he sat for a long time by the window, pipe in hand, watching the faint outline of Sovell Woods in the distance. The lamp beside him flickered, casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. If remorse stirred in him, it left no outward trace. That night, rain began to fall again, steady and thin. It washed the surface of the path, blurred footprints, and sank into the newly turned earth. The plantation grew dark, the air heavy with the smell of wet soil and wood smoke. Somewhere beneath that soil, the hat's feathers flattened under the weight of water, and the body of the young woman who had believed in escape lay still. In the morning, Burton resumed his work. He spoke politely to customers, carried letters to the farms, and accepted congratulations from a neighbor whose son had just enlisted in the Navy. He seemed, if anything, more composed than before. The human mind has a way of disguising itself when survival demands it. In his, the event had already begun to divide into two parts, the act and the explanation. The act was simple, finite. The explanation would become a lifetime's burden. For several days, no one in the village spoke her name aloud. It was as though she had been absorbed by the silence of the countryside, another servant who had gone elsewhere in search of work. Only Rose Mitchell felt the growing emptiness of that silence. Each evening she waited for the sound of footsteps on the path, for the letter that would tell her where her daughter had gone. Each night, none came. On Friday, her younger daughters brought home the bicycle they had found, leaning against the apple tree. Rose placed it by the wall of the cottage and stared at it for a long time. The tires were clean, the seat damp from rain. It looked less like an object left behind than one returned without permission. She felt, though she could not have said why, that it was the beginning of something terrible. And in the distance, through the thin veil of drizzle, the bell of St. Michael's rang again, its sound carrying across the hedgerows, soft but certain, marking the hour as though the village still belonged to time and not to what had just begun. That night in Goussages, St. Michael arrived quietly, with the faint mist that often settled over the fields after a day of rain. Lamps flickered through windows, each house holding its own small circle of light against the encroaching dark. Nothing about that evening appeared unusual. It was a Monday like so many before it. In the Burton household, supper had been eaten, the fire burned low, and the postmaster's lamp still glowed behind drawn curtains. The village, bound by habit, went to sleep believing itself unchanged. Inside the post office cottage, William Burton was as composed as ever. He spoke to his wife in the same steady voice, mentioning small errands, the day's letters, the news from the next parish. Lillian responded with her customary patience, unaware that the hands that poured her tea were still faintly marked with soil. He asked after their son, remarked on how quickly the boy was growing, and then turned to his melodeon. The familiar sound filled the small room, soft wavering notes that drifted upward and out through the cracks of the window frame. To neighbors passing on the lane, that music was part of the evening's reassurance, proof that the world was in order. They might pause to listen before walking on, perhaps thinking how fortunate Lillian was to have a husband so steady, so kind. It was an illusion as complete as any ever constructed in a courtroom. Burton played for nearly half an hour, pausing only once to light his pipe. He appeared tranquil, almost detached, as though the act of music-making was a way of restoring equilibrium after a long day. In truth, the sound served a different purpose. It created distance, a wall of ordinary noise that stood between him and what had been done. Later, when the house was quiet, he sat by the hearth, staring into the fading embers. The smell of damp earth clung faintly to his boots. He would remember every detail of that day for the rest of his life, though in those hours after the killing, he forced the images away, pushing them down into the same place where he had buried her. The mind, when cornered by guilt, learns to compartmentalize. He told himself it had been necessary, that she would have ruined everything, that she had forced his hand. Yet even as he rehearsed these justifications, a small voice within him whispered that no act is ever truly finished while the memory remains. Outside, the wind rose softly through Sovell Plantation, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and disturbed soil. The rain had ended, leaving the world slick and shining under the weak light of the moon. Somewhere in that darkness lay the shallow grave, the earth still uneven, the grass flattened where his boots had pressed. It would be days before anyone noticed the change in the ground, weeks before the truth began to surface. For now, the secret lay intact, guarded by silence and by the ordinary sounds of village life. The following morning, the postmaster rose early, as he always did. He shaved, dressed carefully, and went about his duties. Routine was his refuge, and he clung to it with the precision of a man who knew that deviation invited suspicion. He sorted the mail, unlocked the post office door, and greeted the first customers with a polite nod. He smiled at the rector's wife, carried a parcel to the smithy, and spoke briefly to the schoolmaster about the weather. Each act was deliberate, each gesture part of the mask he wore. No one questioned his composure. In a place where familiarity passed for virtue, consistency was the highest form of trust. People noticed only what confirmed their expectations, and Burton had spent years teaching them what to expect. He moved through those days as though nothing had changed, yet within him the silence began to thicken. At the farm, Winnie's absence was finally impossible to ignore. Her tasks were left undone, her bed empty. The mistress of the house sent word to her mother, inquiring if she had reached London safely. Rose Mitchell, already uneasy, replied that she had heard nothing. The exchange of letters, slow and uncertain, stretched across the first week of April, each message another thread in a net, tightening around a mystery still unspoken. Meanwhile, the people of Gossage St. Michael carried on with their lives. The rector preached on patience and moral duty. The women discussed recipes and ailments. The men talked of markets and livestock. Beneath this rhythm, gossip began to stir. Quietly at first, then with gathering curiosity. Someone mentioned that Burton had been seen walking near Sovell Plantation on Sunday evening. Someone else recalled that he had borrowed a gun. These fragments, detached and incomplete, drifted through conversation like ash on the wind. They did not yet form a story, only a faint pattern that no one wanted to see. In Burton's home, Lillian remained unaware. Her husband's calm was too convincing, her own trust too deep. She noticed, perhaps, that he seemed weary, that his sleep was fitful, that he rose once or twice in the night to stand by the window. When she asked what troubled him, he said it was work, or headaches, or the worry of bills. She accepted these explanations because to doubt him would have meant doubting her entire life. The human instinct to preserve order is powerful. It can turn even the most observant person into an accomplice of silence. And so the days passed, ordinary, measured, seemingly harmless. Burton's melodies continued to drift through the lanes, mingling with the sounds of livestock, the clang of the smith's hammer, the laughter of schoolchildren on their way home. The village listened, comforted by the repetition, never realizing that the music came from a man trying to drown the sound of memory. By mid-April, the stillness began to fray. The police, prompted by Rose Mitchell's report, started to make inquiries, though without urgency. They questioned the servants at Manor Farm, visited the railway station, and checked local lodgings. Each lead dissolved into nothing. The absence remained unexplained, and the assumption that Winnie had gone willingly became harder to sustain. The world outside the village moved on, but within its narrow borders, a kind of unease began to spread. At night, Burton sometimes walked alone along the edge of the plantation. He told himself he was checking traps or counting game, but the real reason was simpler. He needed to see that the earth still held. He would stand in the clearing, pipe glowing faintly in the dark, listening to the wind stir through the branches. He imagined the grave sinking deeper with the weight of rain, imagined the soil hardening above it. Then he would turn back toward the lane, the scent of damp leaves following him like a shadow. From the village, the only sign of him was that same faint glow, his pipe ember flickering among the trees. It might have been mistaken for a lantern, for the harmless presence of a man doing his evening rounds. But to those who would later recall it, that light would come to symbolize something else, the illusion of control before the inevitable unraveling. The night of ordinary sounds ended as it had begun, with silence. The church bell marked 10, the lanes emptied, and the houses darkened one by one. The melody from the post office faded, replaced by the soft ticking of the clock and the slow, measured breath of the man who had learned, at least for a while, how to live beside his own crime. Outside, the fields gleamed faintly under the moon, and somewhere beyond them the woods waited, still holding their secret beneath a thin layer of rain-soaked earth. The news that Winifred Mitchell had not returned home spread slowly at first, like mist creeping along the hedgerows before dawn. For nearly 2 weeks, no one outside her family had questioned her absence. In the world she came from, servants drifted from one position to another with the seasons. Some left after quarrels with their employers, others for marriage, or simply from the restless desire to find something better. So when she vanished without explanation, it was easier for people to believe she had moved on than to imagine that something darker had taken her. Her mother, Rose, waited longer than most might have done. Each evening she walked to the end of the lane, hoping to see her daughter's figure appear, perhaps on foot, perhaps on a wagon, perhaps smiling with the excitement of new beginnings. She told her other daughters not to worry. Winnie was a sensible girl, she said, and would surely write once she was settled. But the tone of her reassurance softened each day, and her eyes searched the road long after the light had gone. The bicycle stood by the cottage wall like an accusation. Rose had brought it home from Sovell Plantation after her younger girls found it there, propped neatly against an apple tree. There was something unnatural in that neatness. It did not look abandoned. It looked arranged. The wheels were unmarked, the seat dry beneath its thin film of dust. The longer she looked at it, the more she felt that it had been placed there for someone to find. In the second week of April, when her patience could bear no more, Rose received an unexpected visitor. William Burton appeared at her door one afternoon, his hat in hand, his manner polite but distant. He said he had heard that Winnie was missing and had come to ask if there was any news. His voice was calm, almost too calm, the words practiced. Rose told him she was worried and was considering going to the police. Burton nodded approvingly. "That's the best thing you can do," he said. His expression did not change. He stood for a few moments longer, offered to help if she needed it, then left as quietly as he had arrived. Later, she would remember his composure, the way his eyes never quite met hers, the faint scent of tobacco that lingered after he had gone. But in that moment, she thought only that he was being kind. He was, after all, the postmaster, a respectable man, a friend to all. At the farm, the conversation about Winnie grew sharper. The mistress complained of the inconvenience her sudden departure had caused, and the servants whispered among themselves about where she might have gone. May Bailey, who knew more than the rest, kept her silence. She remembered Winnie's last words, the promise of a meeting, the insistence on secrecy, and they filled her with unease. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she thought she heard the creak of bicycle wheels on gravel, the faint echo of footsteps beyond the orchard. The police in Wimborne finally opened a formal inquiry, though without urgency. Missing persons were a common business, and most returned of their own accord. The constable assigned to the case asked questions that led nowhere. No train stations recalled a young woman matching Winnie's description. No lodging houses reported a new servant from Dorset. The file was marked unresolved, and the matter might have ended there had not the village itself begun to remember what it had ignored. Small things resurfaced. Someone mentioned that Burton had been seen walking near Sovell Plantation on the evening of March 31st. Someone else recalled that he had borrowed a shotgun from young Leonard Mitchell that same day, returning it a few hours later. At the time, such details had seemed ordinary. Men borrowed guns often. Cats and rabbits were constant nuisances. But as the whispers multiplied, they began to form the outline of a question too dangerous to speak aloud. Burton felt it before he heard it. He noticed the way conversations faltered when he entered a room, the glances that lingered a second too long. He answered every question with the same calm precision, insisting he knew nothing of the girl's whereabouts. When asked about the gun, he laughed and told the same story about the cat. He even joined in the search parties that combed the fields and hedgerows, carrying a lantern, calling her name with the others. To see him then, steady, reliable, efficient, was to see the performance of a man who understood the power of appearances. But guilt, however well concealed, has its own rhythm. At night, his dreams grew vivid. He would wake to the sound of rustling leaves, certain he heard footsteps outside. The melodeon stood silent in the corner now. Its music no longer brought comfort. Lillian noticed the change in him, the sleeplessness, the sudden irritability, but she asked no questions. Respectable households did not discuss unease. They endured it. By the end of April, the police inquiries had produced nothing. The case was fading from official attention, becoming one of those rural mysteries that dissolve into rumor. Then, quite by accident, the silence was broken. On a Sunday afternoon, a dairyman named George Dillingham and his wife were walking through Sovell Plantation when a sudden shower forced them to take shelter under a tree. As they waited, George's wife noticed something pale on the ground near the roots, a small curved object half buried in the wet leaves. She bent to pick it up and found that it was a pair of false teeth, delicate and clean, as though they had been placed there recently. The discovery unsettled them both. They mentioned it the next morning to the village rector, Reverend Wright, a thoughtful man who had known Winnie from her attendance at Sunday services. The rector, uneasy, took the teeth to the local constable and urged him to investigate further. To some, it seemed a trivial clue, easily explained. To others, it was the first tangible sign that the missing girl had not gone willingly anywhere. Word of the discovery reached Burton within a day. He received it with outward indifference, but inward dread. That small object, so ordinary, had become a threat to the order he had built around himself. He knew how quickly rumor could sharpen into accusation. That evening he walked again toward the woods, his pipe glowing faintly in the dark. A shepherd passing nearby saw him standing motionless, looking down at the ground as if studying something that only he could see. When the constables began to search the area later that week, Burton was careful to appear helpful. He suggested paths to check, pointed out old rabbit holes, spoke of travelers who sometimes used the woods as a shortcut. His calmness impressed them. They thanked him for his assistance. It is one of the cruel consistencies of human nature that guilt often hides most easily in plain sight. Meanwhile, Rose Mitchell waited for answers that did not come. Each day she grew quieter, her worry turning inward. She could not bring herself to enter the woods again, but she thought of them constantly. The trees, the bicycle, the print in the soil. Mothers know, even without evidence. Beneath her grief, a certainty was forming, heavy and immovable as stone. The village held its breath. The church bell continued its slow rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours that passed without resolution. The hedgerows thickened with spring growth, the air grew warm, and beneath the shifting patterns of daily life, a secret pressed upward from the earth, waiting for someone to notice the disturbance. And then, one afternoon in early May, two boys searching for bird nests in Sovell Plantation found something that would end the silence forever. It was the afternoon of Friday, the 2nd of May, when the silence finally began to break. The season had shifted again. The air was warmer, the hedgerows dense with blossom, and the fields around Goosage St. Michael glowed with early spring growth. The countryside seemed alive, unaware that beneath the soil of Sovell Plantation, the truth had already begun to stir. Two boys, Edward Bridge and Henry Palmer, both barely 13, had gone into the woods that day in search of birds' nests. It was an ordinary pastime in rural Dorset, a harmless curiosity of childhood that took them far beyond the lanes and into places where adults rarely walked. The boys carried sticks and small baskets, their laughter echoing faintly through the trees. They knew of the shallow trench there. Every child in the village did, but to them it was simply part of the landscape, a place to poke at with sticks, a place of no importance. The week before, they had noticed that the trench was open, the soil freshly dug, and they had spoken of it with the bravado of boys who half expected buried treasure. But on this day, when they returned, something was different. The ground was no longer open. It had been filled in. A pale heap of chalk had been scattered beside it, as though someone had worked hurriedly and without care. The boys stood for a long moment, staring at the patch of earth, uncertain of what it meant. Then, uneasy, they left the woods and went to find Constable Alfred Light, the local officer who was walking his usual round. Light, a patient man, listened to their story and agreed to see the place for himself. He summoned Sergeant Stockley, and together with the boys, they went to the plantation. The ground was still damp from rain, and the leaves stuck to their boots as they made their way to the clearing. When the constable pushed his spade into the soil, the smell that rose was unmistakable, the sour, heavy scent of decay. He dug again, and within minutes, a scrap of fabric appeared, then a piece of dark hair clinging to pale skin. What they found beneath that earth ended the quiet life of Goosage St. Michael. A young woman lay buried scarcely 18 inches deep, her clothes intact, her body twisted as though hastily arranged. She wore a black straw hat trimmed with feathers, flattened by the weight of the soil. The face, though disfigured, still carried the outline of features known to many in the village. There could be no mistake. It was Winifred Mary Mitchell. Word spread faster than the constables could contain it. Before evening, the lanes were crowded with villagers drawn by curiosity and disbelief. They whispered to one another, as though speech itself might summon misfortune. No one could reconcile the reality of the body with the memory of the cheerful young woman who had once cycled through the fields. The shock was not merely of death, but of proximity. That something so dreadful could have happened here, among them, in a place where they believed evil belonged elsewhere. The police cordoned off the area and began their examination. Winnie's jewelry was found still upon her, the brooch she had bought with her savings, and on her wrist, the small gold bracelet that William Burton had given her months before. That bracelet became the first thread in a chain of evidence that would lead directly back to him. At the inquest, the doctor's report was stark. Winnie had been shot twice, once in the head and once in the neck. The wounds were clean, fired at close range, the kind inflicted by someone standing directly before her. The bullet marks suggested she had faced her killer. Death, he said, would have been instantaneous. Back at the post office, Burton heard the news before the constable arrived. It came to him not as surprise, but as inevitability. He had known that the earth could not hold a secret forever. He finished sorting the morning letters, adjusted his jacket, and waited. When Constable Light appeared at his door, Burton greeted him with politeness, as though expecting a routine inquiry. They spoke first of formalities. The constable asked if he had seen Miss Mitchell recently, if he knew of her plans to travel. Burton replied easily that she had mentioned London, that he believed she had already gone. When pressed about the bracelet, he smiled faintly and said that she must have bought it herself. He knew nothing of it. His tone was composed, his eyes steady. But when the officer mentioned the shotgun, something in him faltered, only for a moment. But in that hesitation, the mask cracked. He explained, as before, that he had borrowed the gun to shoot a cat. It was a story rehearsed too well, too often. The constable took notes, nodded, and left to confirm it with the undertaker's son. When young Leonard Mitchum described the encounter, Burton's request, his return of the weapon, the insistence that no one be told, the story's edges began to darken. Within hours, the village was alive with speculation. They spoke of the affair that had been suspected but never named, of the late-night walks, of the music drifting from the post office after dark. Each detail, insignificant on its own, began to fit into a shape too clear to deny. People who had once praised Burton now spoke his name with caution, as if it were dangerous to say aloud. That evening, he walked again through Sovell Plantation. The police had already been there, their lanterns marking the site like stars in the undergrowth. He stood at the edge of the clearing, pipe in hand, staring into the shadows where the earth had been opened. He might have been praying or simply remembering. The constable who later found him there noted the calmness of his face, the stillness of his posture. He did not appear like a man contemplating escape. He looked like one waiting for something he had already accepted. The next morning, Burton was arrested. He offered no resistance. As they led him from the post office, the villagers gathered in silence, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Lillian stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed, her hands gripping the frame as though to steady herself against an invisible wind. Her husband turned once to look at her, then lowered his eyes and said nothing. In the small lockup at Wimborne, he maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had not harmed Winnie, that someone else must have done it, that the body had been placed there to incriminate him. Yet, as the evidence accumulated, the bracelet, the letters, the borrowed gun, his story began to collapse under its own weight. When the constable read aloud the details of the post-mortem, Burton said only, "It is a bad job." He asked for a Bible that night, but did not open it. Instead, he sat in silence, his hands resting on his knees, his thoughts moving in slow, deliberate circles. He spoke once to the jailer before sleep. "The only one I worry about," he said, "is my wife. She is as good a woman as any man could have." Outside, the wind moved through the hedgerows, carrying the low murmur of the village that could not sleep. The story had become larger than any of them now, a story of sin and deception, of trust betrayed, of a secret that could not be contained. And in the morning, as the first light touched the roofs of Gossage St. Michael, the church bell rang again, its tone unchanged, indifferent, marking another ordinary day in a place that would never again be ordinary. The woods at Sovell Plantation had become a place of pilgrimage and dread. What had once been a quiet patch of birch and ash was now alive with the heavy footsteps of police, reporters, and the curious. The villagers came in clusters, their whispers moving through the hedgerows faster than the constables who tried to keep them away. It was as though the entire county had converged on that narrow clearing, drawn by the need to look upon the place where innocence had turned to horror. The police worked methodically, cutting back the undergrowth, marking the ground and photographing what little could be photographed with the cumbersome equipment of the time. The The soil was sifted, the surrounding area searched for discarded objects. What they found was both mundane and chilling. Small fragments of cloth, a few buttons, the outline of a shoe print softened by rain. But the most curious find of all had come days before, almost by accident. The false teeth discovered by the Dillinghams. Those 2 pieces of ivory had seemed, at first, no more than a strange curiosity. Yet as the investigation deepened, they took on the weight of proof. The doctor confirmed that the dentures fitted the jaw of the deceased precisely. Such an intimate correspondence was impossible to dispute. It was the first unanswerable link between the missing girl and the body in the earth. In that small fact, the perfect fit of tooth to bone, lay the collapse of all pretense. The village, which had clung to the idea of misunderstanding, could no longer hide behind uncertainty. The dead girl was indeed Winifred Mitchell, the cheerful servant who had once ridden her bicycle down the lane, hat feathers fluttering like black wings, and the man most often seen with her, the postmaster, was now in custody. Within days, Dorset Constabulary assembled a case. Evidence, though circumstantial, accumulated with relentless precision. The borrowed gun was traced. The witnesses came forward. Leonard Mitchum, the undertaker's son, told of lending his father's shotgun to Burton on the very day Winnie vanished, and of the man's strange request for secrecy. Another villager remembered seeing the postmaster and the girl walking together near the plantation that afternoon, she pushing her bicycle, he smoking his pipe. It was a fleeting glimpse, ordinary at the time, but now transformed into prophecy. The coroner's inquest, held in the small hall near Wimborne, drew crowds far larger than the room could contain. Farmers left their fields, tradesmen closed their shops, and women came clutching prayer books as though to defend themselves from the sight of evil. The testimony unfolded like the slow unpeeling of a wound. The doctor described the wounds, his tone clinical and steady. 2 shots, both fatal, fired from a distance of 4 feet. He spoke of the entry marks, the angle of trajectory, the damage to bone. The words were dry, yet they carried the cold intimacy of dissection. Each syllable erased what remained of the village's illusions about the gentleness of their postmaster. When May Bailey was called, the room fell silent. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She told of Winnie's excitement in the days before her disappearance, of the careful dressing, the whispered plan to meet a man, the insistence on secrecy. She mentioned the small case of clothing, the black straw hat, the promise of a journey to London. Each detail added another layer to the picture the prosecution was building. Then came the bracelet. It was shown to the room, thin gold, delicate, gleaming faintly under the light. May identified it without hesitation. Burton had given it to Winnie months earlier. To some, it seemed an ordinary gift. To others, it was the chain that had bound her to her fate. Throughout the proceedings, Burton sat motionless. He wore a plain brown suit, his hair neatly parted, his expression calm. To those who watched him, he seemed detached, as if attending the trial of a stranger. When addressed directly, he answered softly, never raising his voice. He denied nothing that could be proved, but admitted nothing that could not. The restraint that had once earned him respect now made him appear inhuman. After the inquest, he was remanded to Dorchester Jail to await trial at the next assizes. Reporters from London began to arrive, eager to turn the quiet tragedy into a national spectacle. Their articles described the melancholy murder in a Dorset hamlet, painting the village as a pastoral idyll shattered by lust and betrayal. In their columns, Burton became the singing postmaster, a paradox that fascinated the public, the image of a man who could commit murder and then play the melodeon by his fireside. Back in Gussage St. Michael, life did not return to normal. The post office remained closed, its windows shuttered. Lillian Burton moved through the village like a ghost, avoiding the stares of neighbors who did not know whether to pity or condemn her. Children were told to keep away from the woods, though they still whispered of ghosts and of the girl whose hat had been found buried in the dirt. The rector spoke of sin and redemption, his sermons gentler than before, as though he too struggled to comprehend how such darkness had taken root among his flock. In the evenings, the bell of St. Michael's Church rang as always, but to the villagers its sound seemed altered, hollow, mournful, an echo of loss rather than faith. Meanwhile, in his cell at Dorchester, Burton began to shift between denial and silence. At times he maintained that he was innocent, that someone else had killed the girl and buried her in the plantation to cast suspicion upon him. At other times, he said nothing at all, sitting for hours in stillness, his eyes fixed on the small barred window that offered a slice of sky. He spoke politely to the guards, thanked them for their service, and accepted his meals without complaint. Only once did he lose his composure, when a visiting chaplain spoke of forgiveness. "Forgiveness," Burton said quietly, "is for those who regret. I have only understanding." Outside, the case became a symbol of something larger. In the newspapers and among reformers, it was discussed as evidence of the moral decay hidden beneath rural respectability. How many men, they asked, lived behind such facades, driven by pride and fear? How many women, like Winnie, mistook attention for love because the world gave them no safer form of it? The tragedy had moved beyond one man and one woman. It had become an allegory for the age, the fragility of virtue in a society built upon appearance. When the investigation finally ended, the evidence was neatly arranged, but the village was not. For those who had known them both, it was impossible to reconcile the facts with memory. They spoke of Burton's politeness, his steady manner, his music. They spoke of Winnie's laughter, her modesty, her faith. The mind resists coherence when confronted by contradictions so intimate. And yet beneath all the confusion, the truth remained stark and unmovable, buried first in soil and then in paper. The constables filed their reports, the coroner signed his certificate, and the Crown prepared its case. There was, in the end, little left to discover, only to understand. In early June, as the fields ripened and the village tried to resume its rhythm, a final storm of rain passed over Dorset. It beat down upon the trees of Sovell plantation, washing the last traces of chalk from the grave. The earth, once disturbed, had settled again. The woods returned to their quiet, but they would never again feel entirely benign. Some evenings, children swore they could hear faint music drifting from the direction of the post office, a few wavering notes like breath over a reed. Their parents told them it was imagination, but in a place where the past had taken root so deeply, even imagination carried the weight of truth. By the time the boys led Constable Light and Sergeant Stockley back to Sovell Plantation, the spring sun had already begun to fade behind the low Dorset hills. The air was cool, the smell of earth still heavy from the rain the night before. The two policemen, boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, followed the children along the narrow path between the trees. What had once been their playground, where they had searched for bird nests and secret hiding places, now felt different, weighted by purpose. The boys walked ahead, their earlier excitement subdued. Edward Bridge, the older of the two, pointed silently toward the spot where they had seen the filled-in trench. The clearing was small and unremarkable, surrounded by brambles and thin birch trunks, the ground uneven and speckled with chalk. To any passer-by, it might have appeared an ordinary patch of woodland, but Constable Light, who had served in the county for 2 decades, felt a tightening in his chest as he looked upon it. Some instinct, older than training, told him what he would find there. He motioned for the boys to step back and began to dig. The first few inches yielded nothing but wet leaves and clods of pale dirt. Then the spade struck something softer, the texture different from soil. A faint, sour odor rose into the air. Sergeant Stockley bent to assist, and together they cleared the top layer. Within moments, a scrap of black fabric appeared, then the outline of a sleeve, and finally the curve of a hat, crushed beneath the weight of the earth. The constable stopped, his breath catching. There, tangled in the soil, was a fragment of hair, dark and matted, and beneath it the unmistakable shape of a human face. He covered the spot at once, his voice low but steady as he told the boys to leave. They obeyed without question, running down the path, their footsteps fading into the distance. When they reached the lane, they would burst into speech, their words tumbling over one another in a rush of fear and awe. But for now, the clearing was still, save for the quiet, methodical movements of the men as they widened the hole. What they uncovered was a body. Female, dressed neatly, her clothes remarkably preserved despite the damp. The black straw hat trimmed with ostrich feathers had survived, though bent and discolored. Her hands were folded against her chest as though she had been placed there deliberately. Yet the soil told another story. It had been thrown in hastily, unevenly, the act of someone in a hurry. One shoe was missing. The skin, pale and waxen, bore the marks of gunfire. By the time additional officers arrived, the light had almost gone. Lanterns were lit, casting yellow circles across the clearing, their glow making the scene appear even more unreal. The doctor knelt beside the body, his instruments laid out on a square of oilcloth. The villagers, who had followed the commotion, gathered beyond the cordon, whispering prayers under their breath. Someone recognized the bracelet still on the woman's wrist, and a murmur passed through the crowd like wind through reeds. They did not need to see the face. The jewelry was enough. At the Mitchell cottage, a messenger arrived just after nightfall. Rose opened the door to find the constable standing in the rain, his hat held against his chest. He did not need to speak. The look on his face said everything. She stepped back, hand to her mouth, and for a long time no sound came from her. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from far away, she asked only one question. Was it quick? The constable hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "Quick." In the village, shock settled like fog. The discovery confirmed what many had refused to imagine, and yet it brought no relief. There was a sense that something permanent had been broken, that Gus's saint, Michael, would never again be the same quiet, self-contained world it had once been. The postmaster's house, with its darkened windows, became an object of morbid fascination. People lingered near it when they passed, speaking in hushed tones. Some pitied Lillian, others avoided her entirely as though tragedy might be contagious. Burton himself, confined in Dorchester jail, was told of the discovery the next morning. The warder who brought the news said that the prisoner showed no surprise. He sat for a moment in silence, then replied simply, "So they've found her." He made no further comment. The next day he asked to see the chaplain. When Reverend Thomas entered the small cell, he found Burton seated by the window, the Bible open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed beyond it. He spoke calmly, almost conversationally. "I knew it couldn't stay hidden," he said. "The rain always tells." The chaplain waited, but he offered no further explanation, no confession. Only after several minutes did he add, "It's the waiting that's hardest, not the end, the waiting." In Goussaige St. Michael, the police continued their search for evidence. They returned to the plantation, combing every inch of the ground, finding small remnants, a broken hairpin, a fragment of ribbon, the second shoe. Each item was catalogued, measured, and placed into an envelope. Forensic science in those years was rudimentary, but the officers understood the importance of detail. The physical world, they believed, could speak when people could not. The discovery of the grave transformed the investigation into a national story. Reporters descended upon the village, their notebooks filled with descriptions of rustic innocence betrayed by passion and deceit. They called Sovell Plantation the Dorset Wood of Death, and filled their columns with speculation about motive and morality. The people of the village, who had spent their lives avoiding attention, now found themselves described in newspapers they would never read. Among them, opinions divided. Some believed Burton guilty beyond doubt. Others insisted that he had been led astray by the woman's demands. Old prejudices resurfaced, the suspicion of women who sought love outside the boundaries prescribed for them, the sympathy extended to men who claimed to have been provoked. In parlors and churchyards, the same argument echoed in different words. Was it passion or was it pride? For Rose Mitchell, none of this mattered. She withdrew from public view, her grief quiet and absolute. The funeral was held a week later, a small procession that wound slowly from the cottage to the churchyard. The coffin was plain, unadorned, the wood still smelling of sap. Few spoke. The rector's voice trembled slightly as he read the final rites, his words nearly drowned by the sound of the wind in the trees. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, Rose placed a single sprig of heather on the lid and turned away. That evening, as the mourners dispersed, the village seemed to sink into itself. The bell of St. Michael's tolled once more, its sound carrying over the fields to the woods where the first grave still lay open, raw against the landscape. The constables had filled it in, of course, but the earth was darker there, the grass yet to regrow. It would take years for the ground to forget. The two boys who had found the trench were kept home from school for a time. Their parents said it was for their own good, but it was also to spare them the stares of neighbors who saw in them unwilling witnesses to something that should never have been seen. They would later remember that day with a clarity that outlasted childhood. The smell of the soil, the silence of the policeman, the weight of understanding settling too soon upon their young minds. In the years to come, people would say that the woods of Sovell Plantation never felt the same again. Even on bright afternoons, there was a coolness beneath the trees, a hush that seemed unnatural. Birds avoided the clearing, and villagers took longer routes to skirt the edge. Memory, like the earth itself, holds on to what is buried. And in Dorchester, under the watchful eye of the warders, William Burton began the slow descent into confession, not as an act of repentance, but as a recognition that secrets, once unearthed, have their own voice. For several days after the discovery at Sovell Plantation, the lanes of Goussaige St. Michael filled with strangers. Policemen from neighboring parishes came and went, journalists crowded the inn, and villagers who had spent their lives in anonymity now found themselves questioned, measured, and recorded. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same name, Burton. Each retelling added something new, as though the truth itself were too simple to be believed without embellishment. At the heart of this growing storm, the investigation pressed forward. Dorset Constabulary, though modest in size, worked with grim efficiency. Sergeant Stockley returned to the plantation again and again, studying the ground, retracing the route that connected the post office, the farm, and the clearing where the body had been found. It was a narrow geography, no more than a mile between each point, but within that small space lay the full weight of guilt and consequence. The autopsy report, delivered 2 days later, confirmed what everyone already suspected. Winifred Mitchell had died of gunshot wounds, 2 in all, fired at close range. The first, to the neck, might have stunned her. The second, to the head, was instantly fatal. The doctor noted that the bullets were of a type commonly used in farm shotguns. He also observed, with clinical detachment, that there were no defensive injuries. She had not fought back. She had trusted the person who killed her. That small, brutal detail haunted the rector when he read the report. In his sermon the following Sunday, he spoke of betrayal as a form of violence, of the sin that wears the mask of respectability. He did not name Burton, but the meaning was clear. The congregation sat in silence, eyes downcast. When the final hymn began, no one sang above a whisper. Meanwhile, the evidence against the postmaster gathered like a slow, inevitable tide. The false teeth had identified the victim. The bracelet had identified the connection. But it was the testimony of Leonard Mitchum, the undertaker's son, that hardened suspicion into certainty. He told the constables that on the morning of March 31st, Burton had come to his father's workshop asking to borrow a gun. He said he needed it to deal with a troublesome cat at the farm. Leonard, flattered by the request, had handed it over without hesitation. Later that day, Burton returned it, thanking him and saying the problem was solved. He had seemed hurried, his boots muddy, his manner distant. Before leaving, he added one final request, that Leonard mention the matter to no one. At the time, the boy thought nothing of it. Now, recounting the scene to the police, he felt a cold weight settle on his chest. When confronted with this account, Burton did not deny it. He repeated the same explanation, that he had killed a cat and nothing more. But the words carried no conviction. Each time he spoke, his story grew thinner, as if stretched beyond its strength. The constables noted the tremor in his hands, the sudden dryness in his throat. When they pressed him about the trench, he said he knew nothing of it. When they asked where he had been that afternoon, he said he could not recall the exact hour. Memory, it seemed, was beginning to desert him. The police searched his home thoroughly. In the small writing desk behind the post office counter, they found several letters. Winnie's handwriting, neat and looping, her tone affectionate and pleading. She spoke of plans, of longing, of the child she believed she carried. She wrote of leaving Dorset for London and then to Canada, where they would begin anew. The letters were unsigned, but each one began with the same salutation, "My dearest Bill." For the investigators, these letters transformed the case from a mystery into a confession written in another's hand. They revealed motive, opportunity, and fear. The postmaster's double life was no longer rumor. It was documented fact. When the officers laid the letters before him, Burton stared at them for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said only, "It was a mistake. I should have burned them." Then, after a pause, "She made me believe all sorts." It was the closest he came to admitting the truth, though even then he refused to name his actions plainly. His guilt emerged not in words, but in the collapse of certainty around him. The charge of murder was filed officially on May 7th. Burton was taken from his cell in Wimborne and transferred under escort to Dorchester. The journey was quiet. He sat between two officers, his gaze fixed on the passing fields. When they stopped at a crossroads to water the horses, he looked toward the distant line of woods and said softly, "It's a pity. She was a good girl." Then he turned away and said nothing more. At Dorchester Prison, he was received by the governor, searched, and assigned a small cell on the north wing. The chaplain visited him that evening, reading a passage from the Psalms. Burton listened politely, nodding once or twice, but his attention seemed elsewhere. He asked for paper and ink, saying he wished to write to his wife. The letter, later entered into evidence, was brief and restrained. He told Lillian not to worry, that he was innocent, that everything would soon be resolved. He ended with a line that the prison clerk found curious. "If the truth is to come, it will come from the ground." Outside the prison walls, the case grew larger. Newspapers carried every new detail: the borrowed gun, the discovery of the false teeth, the evidence from the farm. The story appealed to a public eager for reassurance that evil could be neatly contained, that morality, once breached, would always be punished. Editors described Burton as a villain of quiet manners, a man who had deceived an entire village while maintaining the appearance of virtue. The contradiction fascinated them. In Goosage St. Michael, fascination turned to fear. The people who had once spoken warmly of the postmaster now treated his name as a stain. Parents forbade their children to speak of him. The church choir, once his pride, avoided the melodies he had played. Even his melodeon, confiscated during the search, became an object of discomfort. No one wanted it, yet no one dared destroy it. It was placed in the vestry for safekeeping, where its silence seemed louder than its music ever had been. As May turned to June, the machinery of justice gathered speed. Witnesses were summoned, depositions taken, and the Crown prepared its argument. The case, though straightforward in its facts, carried a heavy moral charge. It was not merely about the death of one woman, but about the collapse of an entire social illusion. The belief that small communities were immune to corruption, that respectability protected against sin. The rector, writing in his journal that month, described the atmosphere with weary precision. "The village," he wrote, "has lost its innocence. The people look upon one another with suspicion, as though guilt were contagious. Even the air seems altered, thicker, somehow, harder to breathe." In Dorchester jail, Burton's composure began to erode. He spoke less, ate little, and spent long hours pacing the cell. At night he dreamed aloud, fragments of sentences slipping through the silence. The warder who listened from the corridor heard only a few clear words. "I dug it myself. The trial would come soon enough, but even before the court convened, the verdict had been rendered in the minds of those who once called him friend. The evidence was too precise, the pattern too clear. The only mystery left was not whether he had done it, but why, and whether, in his final moments, he would ever find the courage to name the truth." Outside the prison walls, the summer light lengthened across the fields, turning the woods of Sovell Plantation a deep, unyielding green. The ground there was quiet again, but the air above it seemed to hum with something unspoken, as if the earth itself were remembering. By midsummer of 1913, the story of William Burton had spread far beyond the boundaries of Dorset. London papers printed his likeness, his square jaw, his neatly combed hair, the faintly bewildered look of a man whose decency had collapsed beneath its own weight. They called him the postmaster of two faces, and readers across the country devoured every line of the unfolding tragedy. But in Dorchester prison, the man at the center of it all sat quietly, his world reduced to the dimensions of a narrow cell. He no longer read the newspapers. He no longer asked about the investigation. The truth, when it comes too late, ceases to be of interest. The trial opened on the 1st of July. The assize court in Dorchester was small, its walls close, its windows high. By dawn, the square outside was crowded with onlookers, farmers, laborers, women in shawls clutching newspapers. Some had traveled from neighboring counties, others simply from curiosity. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and wool and anticipation. When Burton entered the dock, the murmuring stopped. He wore his usual country tweeds and a pair of heavy hobnail boots. His hands were clean, his face pale. To the reporters in the gallery, he appeared calm, even detached, as though attending a hearing unrelated to himself. Only the faint tremor of his fingers betrayed the tension beneath his stillness. The proceedings began with the formal charge that William Walter Burton did, on the 31st day of March in the parish of Gossage St. Michael, willfully and feloniously kill and murder one Winifred Mary Mitchell. The words, spoken in the steady voice of the clerk, filled the courtroom like a cold wind. Burton listened, without reaction. The Crown's case was built carefully, layer by layer, each witness a thread woven into the pattern of guilt. Leonard Mitchum was the first to testify. He told the story of the borrowed gun, his voice uncertain but resolute. The courtroom listened in silence as he repeated the conversation, the casual request, the hurried return. When the prosecutor asked if Burton had seemed anxious, the boy hesitated, then nodded. "He looked tired," he said softly, "like he'd been digging." Next came May Bailey, the servant who had shared Winnie's room. Her testimony brought the first tremor of emotion to the proceedings. She spoke of their friendship, of Winnie's excitement on the day she vanished, of the black hat and the small case of clothes. Her eyes filled with tears when she described the last conversation, the promise that Winnie was going to meet someone, that she must tell no one. The prosecutor did not need to ask who that someone was. The police officers followed, describing the discovery of the body, the position of the grave, the recovered items. Then the doctor, his voice calm, precise, devoid of sentiment. He detailed the injuries, the proximity of the gunfire, the nature of death. His words, though clinical, carried the terrible intimacy of physical truth. The jurors looked away, their faces pale in the lamplight. Finally, the letters were produced. The courtroom grew still as the prosecutor unfolded the sheets of paper and began to read. The words were simple, filled with the small hopes of an ordinary heart. "You promised we should go soon. I am not frightened if I am with you. I want to believe you mean it this time. There was no malice, no accusation, only faith. And that faith, now read aloud to a room full of strangers, became its own form of evidence. When asked if the handwriting was his, Burton admitted it was. "We wrote to one another," he said, his voice barely audible, "but I never meant harm." His defense counsel, a weary man assigned by the court, did what he could. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that there were no witnesses to the act, that the girl might have met with another man. He reminded the jury that Burton had maintained his innocence throughout, that he had cooperated with the police, that he had even joined the search for the missing woman. But his words, though logical, could not reach the place where conviction had already taken root. When Burton himself took the stand, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time, the jurors looked upon him not as a story, but as a man. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. He denied killing Winnie. He said she had been distraught, that she had spoken of ending her own life. He said she had begged him to leave with her, that he had refused, that she had threatened to expose him out of spite. "I never meant for harm to come to her," he repeated, again and again. But each explanation seemed to contradict the next. His story changed with the questions. At one moment he claimed not to have seen her that day, at another that he had spoken to her briefly and left her alive. The prosecutor's voice remained steady, but his questions cut deeper with every answer. Why had Burton borrowed a gun? Why had he been seen in the woods afterward? Why had he warned others to stay silent? The postmaster, once admired for his composure, now seemed trapped in his own precision. Every attempt to clarify only tightened the noose of logic around him. When the cross-examination ended, he sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. The jury withdrew at 12:15. 19 minutes later, they returned. The foreman rose, his expression solemn. "Guilty," he said. The word hung in the air, final and irrevocable. Burton did not move. The judge's voice followed, formal and impersonal, pronouncing the sentence that had waited since the first spade struck the soil in Sovell Plantation: death by hanging. The date was set for the 24th of June. As he was led from the dock, Burton paused only once, turning slightly toward the spectators' bench, where a small figure sat clutching a handkerchief. It was Lillian. Her face was white, her hands trembling. Their eyes met for a single moment. Then he looked away and walked through the door that led to the cells below. The newspapers described his demeanor as calm, even stoic. They marveled at his lack of visible emotion, as though contrition must always declare itself. But those who saw him in the days that followed spoke of a different man. The guards at Dorchester noticed his silence, his refusal of food, the hours spent staring at the small square of sky above the prison yard. The chaplain, visiting him daily, found no repentance, only a kind of weary acceptance. "He does not seek forgiveness," the chaplain wrote in his notes. "He seeks understanding, but cannot give it to himself." In the village, the trial's end brought neither closure nor relief. Some still spoke of him with pity, others with quiet rage. The children were kept from the plantation, though the older boys sometimes crept there at dusk, daring one another to stand upon the patch of earth where the grave had been. The woods, once alive with birds, seemed subdued. The melodies of spring had given way to silence. Lillian Burton left the village soon after the verdict. She packed her belongings into a single trunk and took her son to Somerset, where her mother lived. To those who saw her depart, she appeared composed, even serene. But her silence carried the weight of a woman who had outlived her life's meaning. In Dorchester, the condemned man wrote a final letter on the eve of his execution. It was addressed to the chaplain. "There is peace in knowing the worst," he wrote. "I was always afraid of being found out, even before I had done wrong. Fear made me what I am. Tell them she did not suffer." The next morning at 8 o'clock, he was led from his cell. He walked steadily without assistance, his eyes fixed ahead. As he stepped onto the scaffold, he turned once toward the window where the light fell across the wall. "It's a fair morning," he said quietly. Then the trap was released. Outside, the townspeople went about their business. The market opened, the carts rattled along the cobbled street, and the bells of St. Peter's Church marked the hour. In the prison yard, the body of the man once known as the village's most respectable citizen hung still. And far away in the quiet fields of Gassage St. Michael, the wind moved through the hedgerows, carrying with it the faintest echo of a melodeon's tune, thin, uncertain, fading into silence. When the court rose that afternoon, the sound of the verdict still hung in the heavy air. Outside the old stone building, the crowd that had gathered since dawn began to disperse slowly, their murmurs blending with the rattle of carriage wheels and the tolling of distant church bells. Some spoke in low voices of justice served. Others turned away in silence, shaken not only by the crime but by how ordinary the man behind it had seemed. The trial of William Walter Burton had ended as everyone knew it would, with certainty, yet without satisfaction. In Dorchester and beyond, the case became something more than a local tragedy. Newspapers treated it as a kind of moral parable, a reminder that evil could bloom in the neatest gardens, that even the most respectable facade might conceal decay. They described Burton as a man of sober habits, exemplary in demeanor, whose fall from virtue was as sudden as it was complete. But those who had known him found this language too easy, too final. They remembered his quiet greetings, the precise way he handled the letters at the post office, the melancholy songs that had once drifted from his melodeon. It was easier for strangers to call him a monster. The villagers had to live with the thought that he had been one of them. The courtroom itself lingered in memory like a dream half-remembered. The smell of candle wax and wet wool, the rustle of papers, the faint scrape of chairs on the floorboards. Reporters wrote of the stillness that had settled over the room when the jury returned, the way Burton's face remained unreadable as the word guilty was spoken. Some claimed to have seen him tremble. Others swore that he did not move at all. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between perception and the needs of a story. The judge, Sir Archibald Lawson, was known for his reserve. His summing up had been brief, almost mercifully so. He spoke of duty, of the sanctity of human life, of the tragedy of moral weakness. He reminded the jury that pity, though natural, could not outweigh evidence. When the sentence was pronounced, his tone remained calm. "May the Lord have mercy on your soul," he said, not as a benediction, but as a ritual necessity. After the trial, the jurors were dismissed into the sunshine, blinking as though waking from confinement. A few went to the inn, where they drank in silence. None spoke of the deliberation, for there had been little to deliberate. 19 minutes had been enough to end a man's life. Back in his cell, Burton waited. The days that followed were marked by an eerie orderliness, the mechanical rhythm of the condemned man's routine. He rose early, took his meals without appetite, and spent long hours writing letters that he rarely finished. When the chaplain visited, he listened politely but offered no confessions beyond what had already been recorded. "I have nothing new to tell," he said once. "Everything that matters is already buried." The chaplain found him difficult to read. Unlike other prisoners facing execution, Burton displayed neither defiance nor despair. He seemed, instead, to inhabit a kind of suspended calm, as though his life had already ended and he was merely waiting for time to catch up. When asked if he repented, he gave a small, tired smile. "Repentance," he said, "is for those who believe they might be forgiven. I've never been that kind of man." In the press, his composure was transformed into spectacle. Writers debated whether it was courage or indifference. Some saw it as proof of his guilt, others as evidence of moral strength. but in the corridors of Dorchester Prison, those who saw him daily sensed something quieter. A man stripped of pretense, resigned to the inevitability of his end. Outside the walls, the world continued with its own indifferent rhythm. The summer markets opened, the harvest began, and in Goussages St. Michael the post office remained closed, its windows shuttered like blind eyes. Lillian Burton had gone to Somerset with her son, taking little more than her clothes and a few family photographs. She left no note for the villagers, no farewell. Some pitied her. Others whispered that she must have known more than she had ever said. The truth, as so often, was simpler. She had nothing left to say to anyone. In the weeks between sentence and execution, a few visitors came to Dorchester hoping to speak with Burton. One was the rector of Goussages St. Michael, who arrived carrying his worn Bible and a tremor of compassion. He found the prisoner courteous, even grateful for the visit. They spoke for half an hour. The rector urged him to confess fully, to unburden his soul before God. Burton listened, nodding, then said quietly, "I have confessed enough for men. The rest is between myself and the silence." So another visitor was the prison governor, curious to understand what kind of man could commit such a crime without apparent hatred. Burton answered his questions with the same calm that had by now become his only language. "It wasn't anger," he said. "It was fear. She said she'd tell my wife. I thought if I ended it, the fear would stop." He looked down at his hands. "It doesn't." On the 23rd of June, the day before his execution, he wrote a final note to the chaplain. In it, he described the moments leading to the killing, the argument, her threats, his sudden panic. "It was not planned that day," he wrote, "though the thought had been with me longer than I knew. I dug the hole because I could not think of anything else to do. She said my name once, then it was over." The chaplain kept the letter sealed, submitting it to the Home Office as part of the official record. The execution itself took place at 8 o'clock the following morning. Witnesses described it as uneventful, efficient. Burton walked steadily, his step neither hurried nor hesitant. When asked for final words, he said only, "She didn't suffer." Then the signal was given and the trap opened. He was buried within the prison grounds in an unmarked grave alongside other condemned men. A small wooden cross stood for a time, bearing only his initials, before weather and neglect erased them. The world moved on. The newspapers found new scandals, the courts new cases. In Goussages St. Michael, the fields ripened and were harvested, the seasons continuing their endless procession. Yet the memory of what had happened lingered like a stain no rain could wash away. The villagers spoke of it less each year, but the story remained, a warning, a cautionary tale, a reminder that decency, once cracked, reveals something raw and ungovernable beneath. For years afterward, travelers passing through Dorset would ask directions to the place where the postmaster buried the girl. They would walk the path through Sovell Plantation, stopping at the clearing where grass now covered the disturbed earth. The woods, indifferent to human grief, had reclaimed their silence. Only those who knew the story felt the weight that lay beneath the surface. In the end, the trial at Dorchester was remembered not for its drama, but for its clarity. There had been no mystery left to solve, only the slow, deliberate acknowledgement of what everyone already knew, that fear can make a man destroy the very thing that once made him feel alive, and that the face of respectability can hide a heart already eroded by shame. And when the last of the spectators left the courthouse, the doors closing behind them with a heavy finality, the echo that remained was not of the judge's sentence or the crowd's murmur, but of something quieter, the sound of a world that had believed itself safe, learning once again that it never truly was. In the gray stillness of Dorchester Prison, William Burton's confession took form not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual surrender. For weeks after the trial, he had lived within the narrow compass of his cell, moving from bed to chair, from chair to window, the same few paces repeated until the stone beneath his boots grew polished. Outside, the world carried on. The guards changed shifts. The bells of St. Peter's tolled the hours, and beyond the walls, harvest wagons rolled through the Dorset fields. But inside that small square of light and iron, time no longer advanced. It thickened. He had resisted confession for as long as he could. Denial had been his last thread of dignity, the final illusion that he still possessed control over his story. Yet even that, like everything else he had built, began to crumble beneath the weight of silence. Guilt, when kept too long, begins to speak in its own voice. It hums beneath sleep, whispers in the rhythm of footsteps, takes shape in the shadows that gather before dawn. In those long hours when the prison lay silent and the candlelight trembled on the wall, Burton began to listen. The chaplain came each morning with the same gentle insistence. His voice was patient, his manner respectful. He never pressed, merely invited. "A man cannot leave this world carrying what should be laid down," he said one day, standing at the bars. Burton looked at him for a long time before replying. "It doesn't weigh the way you think it does," he said. "It's not a burden you can set aside. It becomes part of the bone." But slowly, in fragments, the story began to emerge. He told the chaplain that the thought of killing Winnie had not come to him suddenly on that Monday afternoon. It had been forming quietly in the weeks before. It was not hatred, he said, nor anger. It was fear of discovery, fear of losing everything he had built. He described how her insistence, her hopefulness, had begun to close in around him. "She believed in me too much," he said. "She thought I could be more than I was. And I knew I couldn't. Every time she looked at me, it was like a mirror I didn't want to see myself in." The decision, he said, had been made before he could name it. It was an instinct turned inward, a desperate bid to preserve a life already rotting from within. He had convinced himself that if he removed her, the fear would end, that he could go on as before, husband, father, postmaster, the good man of a small village. "I didn't plan it as murder," he said. "I planned it as silence." He spoke of that last meeting with a strange detachment, as though describing someone else's actions. He said she had been cheerful at first, that she had spoken of London and Canada, of new beginnings. He had listened, his mind emptied of everything but the sound of her voice. When she told him again that she would write to his wife if he refused to go, he said something in him broke. "It wasn't rage," he said. "It was something colder, a sort of clarity. I just wanted it to stop." He told of firing once, then again, watching her fall without a word. The woods, he said, were utterly silent afterward, as if even the birds had turned away. He buried her quickly, mechanically, his thoughts blank. He remembered only the sound of the spade striking stone, the faint whisper of soil covering cloth. When it was done, he sat for a long time beside the grave before walking home. "I thought," he said, "that by the time I reached the lane I could start again, but you can't bury fear. You only give it a place to wait." The chaplain listened without interruption, recording what he could recall afterward. There was no moment of breakdown, no plea for absolution. Burton spoke like a man explaining the function of a clock, methodical, almost detached. When the account was finished, he closed his eyes and said, "That's all there is of it. You can tell them she didn't suffer. It was quick." That sentence would later echo through the official record, repeated in newspapers and in the chaplain's report. She didn't suffer. But those who heard him say it understood that the words were not about her. They were about himself. He wanted to believe that cruelty once committed could still be measured, that mercy might yet be salvaged from horror. In the days that followed, he grew quieter still. He stopped writing letters, stopped asking questions. The governor, noting his calmness, said that he had the look of a man already half gone. Yet beneath that calm lay a kind of awakening. He began to speak more freely with the chaplain, not of crime but of the strange duality of his life, the man he had been and the man he had become. "I think I was two people for too long," he said one morning. The first was the one they saw. The careful man, the good husband, the postmaster who kept to his duty. The second lived in the cracks between hours. He wanted something more, something he couldn't name. When the second man took hold, the first one just stood by and watched. He paused, then added, "That's the trouble with sin. It doesn't shout. It whispers until you start to believe it's your own voice." These reflections, sparse as they were, revealed a mind that had come to understand too late the anatomy of its own undoing. Burton did not excuse himself. He did not even seek understanding. He seemed only to wish that someone else might learn from his failure. "You spend your life trying to be decent," he said. "But decency isn't goodness. It's fear of what people will think. And fear, in the end, was all I ever had." On the evening before his execution, the chaplain visited him for the final time. The cell was dim, lit only by a small oil lamp. Burton was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He looked up and smiled faintly. "You were right," he said. "It feels lighter once it's spoken." The chaplain offered to pray with him, and he nodded, though his lips moved only once during the prayer, when the words "deliver us from evil" were spoken. That night, he slept for the first time in many weeks. The warder on duty said he heard no movement, no sound until the morning bell. At dawn, when the sky above the prison yard turned the color of pewter, Burton rose, dressed carefully, and asked for water to wash his face. He ate a small piece of bread, refused tea, and waited in silence. When the chaplain arrived to accompany him to the scaffold, he thanked him for his kindness and said, "I hope she is at peace now." They walked together through the narrow corridor, past the guards who stood with bowed heads. In those last few moments there was no sign of fear, only the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to hide. At precisely 8 o'clock, the signal was given. The executioner adjusted the rope, stepped back, and pulled the lever. The sound was brief. A single thud, a rush of air, and then silence again. Outside, the morning sun broke over the rooftops of Dorchester, touching the stone walls with a pale, indifferent light. In his report that afternoon, the chaplain wrote, "He met his death with composure. His final words were for the victim, not for himself. I believe he understood at last what he had done, though understanding came too late to matter." And beyond the prison, in the small Dorset village that had once trusted him, the fields lay still beneath the same sky, the church bell marking the hour as it always had. Yet for those who remembered, that morning's toll carried a different sound, a hollow note of reckoning and of release. Morning in Dorchester arrived gray and windless on the 24th of June, 1913. The prison courtyard was already awake, though nothing within it stirred. The warders moved softly, as if the day demanded quiet, and the chaplain walked with his head lowered, murmuring a prayer meant as much for himself as for the man he would soon accompany. Inside the north wing, the air was heavy with the smell of lime and oil. The stone walls, darkened by decades of breath and damp, held every echo too long. In the corridor outside Cell 17, the governor stood waiting with the surgeon and 2 assistants, their faces pale, their uniforms immaculate. When the door opened, William Burton rose without hesitation. He had slept, they said later, more soundly than anyone expected. He dressed carefully in the same brown tweeds he had worn at his trial, clean, pressed, and smelling faintly of soap. He nodded to the chaplain and said simply, "I am ready." No one spoke as they began the short procession through the corridor, the slow shuffle of boots against stone marking each second more precisely than any clock. At every turn, the same ritual: a door unbolted, a pause, a door closing behind. The air grew colder as they neared the yard. Burton kept his eyes forward, neither hurrying nor hesitating. The chaplain walked beside him, reading softly from the Book of Common Prayer, his voice steady, though the words trembled in the air. It was not yet 8 o'clock when they stepped into the light. The sky was a washed-out silver, the kind of morning that promises neither rain nor sun, only endurance. The gallows stood in the corner of the yard, stark against the wall, its timbers newly tarred. A few officials waited nearby, the sheriff, the clerk, the hangman, and 2 silent witnesses. The surgeon checked his watch. The governor gave a small nod. Burton glanced once toward the open sky, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "It's a fair morning," he said. Then he mounted the steps. What passed next was brief, precise, practiced, unceremonious. The rope was placed, the white cap drawn. The chaplain's voice rose, the words of the Lord's Prayer carried by the faintest wind. When he reached "Deliver us from evil," the lever fell. It was over before the last syllable had faded. The body hung motionless, the morning still unbroken by sound. The surgeon waited the prescribed minutes, then nodded once. The witnesses signed their names. The clerk folded the paper, the hangman removed his gloves, and the yard emptied as quickly as it had filled. Only the chaplain lingered, his hands clasped, his lips moving in a prayer that no one heard. Inside, the bell rang once, an old custom marking that justice had been done. But beyond the prison walls, few knew or cared that the first execution at Dorchester in 26 years had taken place. The world outside had its own business, its own noise. By the time the church bells of the town marked 9 o'clock, the markets had opened, trains were departing, and the story of William Burton was already sliding into history. His body was taken down at mid-morning, examined, and then carried to a small plot within the prison grounds. The grave was shallow, the marker simple, a wooden board with the initials WWB burned faintly into its surface. Within a few years, the letters would fade, the marker sink, and the name disappear from view. But for those who had seen him in life, his absence would prove harder to bury. The chaplain wrote a report that afternoon, as the procedure required. His handwriting was precise, the sentences measured. He noted the condemned man's composure, his courtesy to all present, his lack of outward fear. He appeared resigned, he wrote, not in despair, but in quiet acceptance. His final words were for the deceased woman, not himself. He expressed the wish that her family might forgive him, though he did not presume it. The report closed with a line seldom included in such documents. The prisoner met death with understanding rather than repentance. That distinction mattered. In an age that valued remorse as proof of salvation, understanding offered something less comforting, but perhaps more human. Burton did not seek mercy because he no longer believed in it. What he had come to know was colder and more absolute, that the act itself had already written its own ending, and that redemption, like innocence, was a thing of the living, not the dead. Word of the execution reached Goussaige St. Michael by the following evening. It came first through the post, then through conversation. Some claimed relief, others unease. The village, though small, contained its own hierarchy of silence. The rector mentioned it only briefly in his next sermon, reminding his congregation that judgment belongs to God alone. Few found comfort in the reminder. For Lillian, the widow, there was no message, no official notice. She read the account in the local paper, tracing each line with her finger as though to make the words less real. The article was brief. William Walter Burton was executed at Dorchester Prison on Tuesday morning for the murder of Winifred Mary Mitchell of Goussaige St. Michael. He met his death calmly. That was all. She folded the paper neatly and placed it in a drawer she would later lock. Her son, barely 3 years old, would grow up knowing little of his father beyond whispers. The family moved often in the years that followed. First to Somerset, then to Yeovil, where Lillian found work in a glove factory. She rarely spoke of the past. When neighbors asked about her husband, she said only that he had died before the war. In time, even that lie became unnecessary. People stopped asking. But memory is stubborn. In the quiet of certain nights when the factory siren had long fallen silent, she would think of the small Dorset village she had left behind, the lane outside the post office, the smell of rain on chalk, the sound of the melodeon drifting through the evening air. She could not hate the man she had married, though she tried. Love, once lived, does not dissolve cleanly. It leaves sediment, fine and unshakable. In Gossage St. Michael, life resumed its steady rhythm. The post office reopened under a new keeper. The church bells regained their familiar sound, and the hedgerows bloomed as they always had. Yet for those who remembered, the landscape was altered. Every path seemed to pass some invisible threshold of loss. The plantation where the grave had been found grew thick again, its soil covered in wild primrose and nettle. Children avoided it instinctively, as if the air itself whispered a warning. In 1986, more than 70 years later, a local historian named Roger Guttridge interviewed an elderly woman who had been 9 years old at the time of the murder. Her name was Gladys Isgar, and she still lived near Wimborne. She recalled the terror that gripped the village, the way mothers forbade their children to stray near the woods. "It really was a dreadful thing," she told him. "We were frightened every time we walked up to the chapel. We couldn't bear to look toward the plantation. Even when I was grown, I never liked to pass that way." By then, the story had settled into the long memory of rural England, one of countless small tragedies folded into the fabric of the past. Yet it persisted precisely because it had no heroes, only ordinary people caught in the web of fear, desire, and circumstance. In the final measure, William Burton's walk to the scaffold was less a punishment than a completion. He had crossed the threshold he himself had built, from respectability to ruin, from concealment to revelation. The village that had once admired him now remembered him only as a warning that the darkness capable of such acts is not foreign or monstrous, but human, and therefore universal. And so the morning passed into afternoon, the sun breaking through at last over the prison yard, touching the stones that still held the echo of his final footsteps. Beyond the walls, the Dorset countryside lay calm and indifferent, the fields bright with summer. The season turned as it always did, carrying away the sound of the gallows, leaving only silence behind. When the scaffold was dismantled and the prison yard swept clean, the story of William Burton should have ended there. But endings in such cases are never tidy. The machinery of justice moves on, but the residue it leaves behind clings quietly to those who lived in its shadow. In Dorset, the fields ripened as they always had, and the bells of St. Michael's resumed their calm rhythm. Yet the air over Gossage St. Michael felt altered, as though a thin film of unease now separated the living from the past. For the villagers, the execution closed a chapter they could not forget. They spoke of it in fragments, never for long, and only when the silence grew too heavy to bear. Some pitied the man, others cursed his name. But most, when asked, would say only that it was a tragedy, an old, blunt word that seemed to cover every kind of suffering without explaining any. The woods at Sovell Plantation, once a place of stillness and green light, became something darker in imagination. Its paths were avoided, its name whispered. Parents told their children not to wander there, and even decades later, those who strayed among its trees described a faint heaviness in the air, a sense that something beneath the soil still waited to be acknowledged. For the Mitchell family, there was no such option as forgetting. Rose Mitchell lived on for many years, her grief wearing down into something harder and quieter than sorrow, a permanent narrowing of the world. She rarely spoke of her eldest daughter. The bicycle remained in the cottage shed, its frame rusted, its tires long deflated. Once a neighbor suggested she sell it, but Rose shook her head. "It belongs where she left it," she said. That was all. The small case Winnie had carried on her final day was never found. Rose's younger daughters married, moved to other towns, raised children of their own. They carried the story like an heirloom, kept it but did not display it. In private moments, they wondered about the child Winnie had believed herself to be carrying, and whether that hope, false though it proved, had been what condemned her. She thought love was enough, one sister said many years later. But love wasn't made for girls like us. It was something we borrowed, not something we owned. In this, she spoke to a truth larger than her family's loss. For women of Winnie's class, love was dangerous currency. To be desired outside marriage was to risk ruin. To hope for escape was to invite tragedy. In every account of the case, from the coroner's notes to the newspaper editorials, her death was treated as the consequence of passion, rather than the failure of a society that left her without choices. The men of Dorset shook their heads and spoke of temptation. The women lowered their eyes and said that such things came of foolishness. But beneath their words ran another current, resentment, perhaps, or recognition. The press, eager for moral clarity, had painted the story in black and white. Burton, the respectable man undone by lust. Winnie, the servant girl whose ambition exceeded her place. But the truth, if it existed at all, lay somewhere in the grays between them, in the silence of the village, in the quiet complicity of a world that valued appearance above truth. The trial had been about a murder, but the life that led to it was about confinement, social, moral, and emotional. In the years that followed, the crime slipped gradually from national memory, buried beneath wars and new tragedies. Yet within Dorset, it remained a marker in local history, a reminder of how easily the surface of order could fracture. Occasionally, an old-timer would point out the plantation to travelers, saying, "That's where it happened." Nothing more was needed. The phrase carried its own gravity. The Burton name faded too. Lillian never returned to Gussage St. Michael. In Somerset, she lived quietly, working long hours in the glove factory and raising her son with a diligence that bordered on austerity. Those who knew her described her as reserved but kind, with eyes that seemed always to look past the person she was speaking to. She never remarried. Her son, Cyril, grew into a gentle, unassuming man. He learned the trade of glove cutting, married a nurse, and built a small, steady life of his own. On his wedding day, his cousin served as best man, a quiet echo of the family his mother had lost. When Lillian died in 1930 at the age of 58, the local newspaper devoted 3 lines to her passing. No mention was made of her husband. History, by then, had grown weary of remembering. Yet memory is a stubborn thing, especially in places that change slowly. In Gussage St. Michael, older residents still spoke of the postmaster who played the melodeon, of the pretty girl with the feathered hat, of the bicycle by the apple tree. The story was told differently each time. Some said she had gone to meet him out of love. Others said he had lured her there by deceit. In every version, the Woods were the same: quiet, secretive, complicit. The landscape itself had become part of the narrative, its trees bearing silent witness to the human failings played out beneath them. By the mid-20th century, when the fields of Dorset had begun to fill with tractors and telegraph poles, the story had taken on the quality of folklore. Children whispered that the plantation was haunted, that on misty evenings one could hear the faint sound of music drifting from the trees, the ghost of Burton's melodeon still playing for forgiveness. Adults smiled at the superstition, but they too avoided the path after dusk. Some wounds, though covered by years, never heal. They only change their shape. In the 1980s, when the Dorset Wildlife Trust took ownership of the land and reclassified it as part of the Sovell Down Nature Reserve, the murder was briefly rediscovered by local historians. Newspaper archives were combed, parish records reread. Interviews were conducted with the few remaining villagers who still remembered the echoes of that time. One of them, Gladys Isgar, then 82, spoke with a clarity undimmed by age. "It came as a great shock," she said. "It frightened us, truly. I used to walk to chapel with my sister, and after that we never took the short way again. You could see the trees from the road black against the sky. We always looked the other way." Her recollection brought the story back into print once more, though now framed not as a scandal but as a study of human frailty. Writers spoke of class, of isolation, of the moral strictures that had defined Edwardian England. They wrote less of passion and more of constraint, how the boundaries of propriety had cornered both victim and killer alike. In this retelling, Burton was not a monster, but a man trapped by the expectations he had spent his life trying to meet. Winnie, too, was seen differently, not as a temptress, but as a young woman seeking agency in a world that denied it to her. In time, even these interpretations would fade, replaced by the quiet persistence of place. Today, the Sovell plantation forms part of a protected reserve, its trees older, its undergrowth dense and still. There is no marker to tell what happened there, no plaque or stone. Nature has reclaimed the clearing. Birds nest where once the soil was disturbed. Yet to walk there is to feel a subtle shift in the air, as though the landscape itself remembers. It is said that history belongs to those who survive it, but stories like this suggest otherwise. They do not belong to anyone. They simply endure, repeating themselves in quieter forms, reminding us of what lies beneath the veneer of order and civility. And so, the story of William Burton and Winifred Mitchell remains, not as a moral lesson, nor as a cautionary tale, but as a fragment of human truth buried in English soil. The woods have forgotten their grief, but the silence they hold is still the same. Time, that soft and relentless undertaker, had buried most traces of the crime by the middle of the 20th century. Yet stories like this never die completely. They linger in the corners of memory, in the pages of forgotten archives, in the folds of a countryside that cannot quite forget what it has witnessed. In Goussage's St. Michael, the years drifted forward with the rhythm of seasons, but beneath the churn of plows and the bell of St. Michael's, something of the past continued to whisper. By then, nearly everyone who had known the Burtons or the Mitchells was gone. The cottages had been repaired, whitewashed, and sold to newcomers who came seeking the quiet charm of the Dorset hills. They knew nothing of the plantation's old name or why some villagers still avoided its paths. The post office was now a private house. The church, unchanged but for its aging stones, still faced the wind from the south. The tragedy had receded into the landscape, as tragedies do, its outlines blurred by distance, its details softened by the politeness of forgetting. But forgetting, in England, is rarely complete. History survives in fragments, folded letters, parish notes, an old photograph in a drawer, and through those fragments, the past murmurs its unfinished sentences. It was through such fragments that the story of the postmaster and the servant girl began, slowly, to re-emerge. Not as a headline or a scandal, but as a question that would not stay quiet. In the early 1980s, when local historian Roger Guttridge began collecting accounts of rural Dorset crimes, he stumbled upon the name of Winifred Mary Mitchell in an old coroner's ledger. The entry was brief, its handwriting neat, its tone detached. Female, 24. Cause of death: gunshot wounds to head and neck. Verdict: willful murder. There was no mention of the village, no story attached, only the dry evidence of what had once been a life. Guttridge followed the trace, uncovering newspaper clippings browned by age, court transcripts filed under dust, and a single photograph of Dorchester Prison, the last place William Burton had seen the sky. He spoke with the few who still remembered. Among them was Gladys Isgar, then in her 80s, who recalled walking to chapel as a child and glancing nervously toward the line of trees where the murder had taken place. "We never went that way after," she said. "My mother said the ground there was bad." Her voice, he wrote later, carried the weight of a fear that had outlived its cause. The woods themselves had become a symbol, less of the crime than of the silence that followed it. When Guttridge's book was published, the story found new life. Readers were struck not by the violence of the act, which seemed almost modest compared to modern crimes, but by the intimacy of its setting, the smallness of the world in which it had happened, the ordinariness of the people involved. There was no villain in the theatrical sense, no dark genius or stranger from elsewhere, only a man whose fear had turned inward, and a woman whose hope had nowhere safe to land. The book revived the story, but it also altered it. Modern readers, more skeptical of moral absolutes, saw in Burton not only a murderer, but a product of his time, a man bound by duty, reputation, and a terror of exposure. They saw in Winifred a woman constrained by class and gender, punished less for what she had done than for what she had wanted. What had once been a cautionary tale about sin became, in this retelling, a study in social suffocation. Yet even this new understanding could not strip the story of its melancholy. For all the analysis and empathy of hindsight, the essential tragedy remained unmovable. 2 lives undone by the quiet violence of shame. In the delicate machinery of Edwardian morality, guilt was not born of conscience, but of discovery. To be found out was the true disgrace. And it was that fear, the fear of being seen, that had driven William Burton to the woods that afternoon. As decades passed, the plantation changed hands, the village expanded, and the story once again began to fade. But traces of it surfaced in unexpected places. A letter from a vicar, filed in the diocesan archives, describing the distressing business of the postmaster. An old school book belonging to a Mitchell niece, containing the words, "Poor Aunt Winnie," written faintly on the inside cover, and most poignantly, a single parish record dated 1913 noting a memorial service for the departed. No name was listed. Perhaps none was needed. Everyone in the village would have known who it was for. By the early 21st century, only the most attentive visitors to the Dorset countryside would have reason to stumble upon Sovell Plantation. It lies just beyond a narrow lane, its boundary marked by a low stone wall and a wooden sign that reads, "Nature Reserve." The woods are dense now, a mixture of oak and ash, their branches knotted with ivy. The air smells of moss and wet earth. On still days, one can hear the faint hum of insects and occasionally the cry of a kestrel circling overhead. There is nothing outwardly remarkable about the place, nothing to suggest what once happened there. Yet those who walk its paths often speak of a certain hush that falls as they enter, a stillness that seems to listen. Historians sometimes call this the persistence of place, the idea that landscapes remember what people forget. The soil that once covered Winifred's grave has long been disturbed, the remains reinterred elsewhere, but the memory of that act, of concealment and discovery, still clings to the earth like an aftertaste. The plantation, in that sense, has become both witness and archive, a living record of the human frailties that shaped it. The story's endurance owes less to its details than to its familiarity. It is, at its heart, an English tragedy of a kind that repeats itself endlessly in different forms. A man trapped by the expectations of propriety, a woman undone by the limitations of her time, a community struggling to reconcile morality with compassion. The names change, the circumstances shift, but the pattern remains. Fear masquerading as virtue, love crushed by shame, the individual swallowed by the collective need to appear righteous. If there is a lesson to be drawn from the echo of Gusage St. Michael, it lies not in condemnation but in recognition. Burton was neither monster nor martyr, and Winnie was neither temptress nor saint. They were 2 people born into a world too narrow to hold their mistakes. His crime was monstrous, but it grew from soil fertilized by centuries of repression. Her death was senseless, but it exposed the quiet cruelty of a system that punished desire more severely than deceit. Today, the village is peaceful again, its cottages framed by roses and stone, its lanes unchanged in their gentle winding. The post office stands as a home now, its sign removed, its past invisible to those who pass. The churchyard holds no monument to either of the lost souls whose fates once intertwined there. Only the land endures, patient and unjudging, its silence deeper than words. And yet, on certain evenings when the air is still and the last light fades over the Dorset hills, One might imagine hearing faint music from somewhere unseen, an echo, perhaps, of a melody once played by a man trying to forget the sound of his own guilt. The tune drifts, falters and fades, swallowed by the quiet that follows every confession, every burial, every century. It is said that time erases all wounds, but in truth, it only changes their form. What remains of the murder at Goussaye St. Michael now lives not in records or headstones, but in the quiet persistence of memory. The way a story once told settles into the soil and waits to be found again. A century has passed, and the village rests in peace, its cottages softened by ivy, its roads too narrow for haste. Yet if one stands near the old plantation on a still evening, when the wind drifts low through the fields, the air itself seems to recall what the people have chosen to forget. History, like the land, keeps its secrets in layers. Beneath the surface of this countryside lie countless small tragedies, unrecorded loves, unspoken griefs, wrongs unrighted. The story of William Burton and Winifred Mitchell is only one of them, but it lingers because it feels familiar. It is a story about the cost of silence and the things that respectability cannot conceal. In its details, the postmaster's borrowed gun, the servant girl's bicycle, the shallow grave in the chalk, it carries something universal. These are not symbols of wickedness or innocence, but of human frailty. For all the distance between their time and ours, the emotions that drove them remain recognizably our own. Fear, pride, longing, shame. These are the materials from which most lives are built. Burton's crime did not begin in the woods. It began in the quiet tension of an ordinary marriage, in the small deceit that grows from loneliness, in the weight of a secret that no longer fits inside the life that must appear flawless to others. Winnie's death, too, began long before the fatal meeting, when she learned that her worth would always be measured by others, when she mistook affection for escape, when she believed that hope alone could outrun circumstance. The world of 1913 was one poised between ages, still bound by Victorian restraint, yet on the edge of modern disillusionment. The Great War lay just a year ahead, ready to shatter whatever moral order remained. In that sense, the murder in the Dorset countryside feels almost prophetic, a private catastrophe foreshadowing the collective ruin to come. It exposed, in miniature, the same forces that would soon remake Europe: fear of change, faith in appearances, the slow corrosion of conscience under pressure. The investigators who followed the trail from the bicycle to the grave could not have known they were witnessing the end of an era. Their notes, written in the dry language of procedure, tell of spades and footprints, of witnesses and testimony. But between those lines lies the tremor of a society struggling to understand itself. The police spoke of motive, the newspapers spoke of morality, the villagers spoke of sin. None spoke of isolation. Yet that, more than passion or malice, was what defined both the killer and the killed. They lived within a system that demanded propriety above honesty, endurance above confession. When emotion could no longer be contained within the rules, it burst outward with fatal consequence. In that way, the case of William Burton is not a tale of evil, but of the limits of goodness. The postmaster was, by all accounts, a diligent man. He worked hard, served his community, maintained appearances. But goodness built on fear is brittle. The facade of decency can hold only until life demands truth, and then it collapses. Burton's tragedy was not that he was wicked, but that he mistook conformity for virtue. When the choice came between truth and reputation, he chose reputation, and found it led him to ruin. Winifred, meanwhile, paid the greater price for wanting what the world denied her. In another century, her dream might have been harmless, a young woman wishing to travel, to start anew. But in the Dorset of her time, such ambition was audacious. She belonged to a class that was expected to serve, not to desire. The same community that pitied her after her death would have condemned her had she lived and borne a child out of wedlock. The tragedy, then, is not only in her murder, but in the narrowness of the world that made it inevitable. The law fulfilled its duty. The trial was fair, the evidence compelling, the sentence carried out. Yet justice, even when perfect in form, is rarely complete. No gallows could restore what was lost or mend what was broken in that small village. The people of Gossage St. Michael, bound together by geography and suspicion, lived for years under the shadow of what had happened among them. They continued to worship in the same church, to pass the post office on their way to market, to see in one another's faces the memory of trust betrayed. The punishment fell on the entire community, not just on the man who swung beneath the rope. The years softened the story but did not cleanse it. With each retelling, the edges blurred, morality shifted, and sympathy changed its allegiance. At first, the focus had been on Burton's fall from grace. Later, it turned to Winnie's suffering, and later, still, to the social machinery that trapped them both. This evolution of meaning is itself part of history's pattern. Crimes outlive their explanations, and every generation rewrites them in its own image. What began as scandal became warning, and what was once warning became reflection. The plantation, meanwhile, continued its slow reclamation by nature. Seasons turned the ground, roots spread through the soil, and rain washed away the last traces of the grave. What was once a site of horror became, over time, a sanctuary for life. Birds returned. Wildflowers grew. The air, once heavy with dread, carried the scent of earth and pollen. Yet the silence there retained a weight, a depth that those who walked the paths could feel but not define. It was not haunting, exactly, but remembrance, the kind of stillness that follows confession. For those who come upon the story now, in print or whispered retelling, it serves less as a chronicle of crime than as a meditation on the strange endurance of guilt. The details, names, dates, evidence belong to history, but the emotions belong to everyone. The fear of being discovered, the longing to be forgiven, the loneliness of secrets too heavy to bear. These are not relics of a bygone world. They are the quiet constants of human life. Perhaps that is why the tale of Gossage St. Michael continues to be told. It is not the murder itself that fascinates, but the mirror it holds up. Within it, we glimpse not only the postmaster and the servant girl, but fragments of ourselves, the parts that hide, that deceive, that ache for absolution. The Woods may have forgotten, but we, being human, cannot. If one were to stand today beneath the trees of Sovell Plantation, the sound would be of wind in the leaves, the rustle of creatures unseen, the faint murmur of a stream nearby. There is no marker, no sign of violence, no trace of graves. Only the quiet rhythm of the natural world, enduring, indifferent, complete. Yet for those who know the story, that quiet carries meaning. It is not accusation nor forgiveness. It is simply the echo of what it means to be human, to love, to fear, to destroy, and to remember. In the end, all that remains of William Burton and Winifred Mitchell is what remains of everyone, an imprint left upon others, an alteration in the texture of the world. Their names are written in parish records and in the soil of Dorset. Their story passed like a faint inheritance from voice to voice. It begins in scandal and ends in silence, which may be the closest thing to peace this world affords. For silence, at last, is what every confession becomes. And so, as the evening light fades through the branches and the wind drifts low across the field where once a bicycle stood against an apple tree, the land exhales its long memory. Nothing moves, nothing speaks, only the quiet remains, vast, unbroken, and whole again.